My parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with one chilling warning: do not make a scene. I watched their car speed away and opened the lid. What I saw inside nearly brought me to my knees. Trembling, I dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped through the front door, saw two police officers in our foyer, and turned pale. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," he stammered. "My name is Fiona, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in my quiet Chicago suburb. Through the front window, I watched my parents' silver Mercedes SUV speed out of my driveway. The tires screeched, leaving dark marks behind. My mother, Joanne, was in the passenger seat. My father, Harrison, was driving. They had simply pulled up, left something on the porch, and driven away like criminals. I slowly unlocked the front door. Sitting perfectly centered on my front welcome mat was a box. It was wrapped in heavy silver paper and tied with a navy blue silk ribbon. It looked exactly like the very expensive gifts my mother presented at charity galas. Tucked under the ribbon was a thick cream-colored card. I recognized my mother's elegant looping handwriting immediately. I pulled the card free and slowly read the words: "Do not make a scene. Transfer the gallery deed to your sister by Friday, or your client's financial data goes public." I stood frozen, staring at the words. Transfer the gallery deed to Whitney, my sister, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life. For the past decade, I had poured my soul into building my luxury antiquities brokerage. I started it from a rented office with zero financial help from my family. Now my mother was casually demanding I sign it away. I picked up the heavy box, carried it inside, and walked straight to the kitchen island. My hands were steady. There were no tears. I had spent my childhood crying over my parents' favoritism toward Whitney. I had exhausted my tears years ago. Today I only felt a cold, burning clarity. I untied the navy ribbon and tore away the silver paper. I lifted the lid of the rigid cardboard box and looked inside. The contents were arranged with deliberate, cruel precision. First, I saw 3 black encrypted flash drives resting in a foam insert. They were the secure backup drives from my office vault. Those drives contained the confidential financial portfolios of my most elite clients. If that data went public, it would result in massive lawsuits and destroy my professional reputation. My mother knew exactly where to strike to cause the most devastating damage. Next to the flash drives lay my actual blue passport. I kept it locked in a hidden drawer in my home office desk. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been inside my house. Someone who knew where I kept my personal documents. My parents had invaded my home. Beneath the passport and the drives lay a pile of shredded, yellowed parchment paper. Even in pieces, I recognized the heavy textured paper and the faded blue ink of the notary stamp. It was my late grandfather's original handwritten will. My grandfather was the only person in my family who truly saw me. He left me a private collection of antiquities that became the foundation of my business. My parents had been furious, believing all wealth should remain under my father's control to fund Whitney's failed ventures. The original will was proof that someone believed in my potential. My mother had shredded it. I stared at the shredded paper and encrypted drives. This was a calculated attack. They had stolen corporate secrets. They had destroyed personal documents. And they were using it all to extort a $2 million commercial property from me. My mother had warned me not to make a scene. She expected me to call her crying, begging for mercy, asking what I needed to do to fix things. She relied on the childhood dynamic where I would always yield. She was wrong. Instead of calling her or collapsing in despair, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911. I provided my home address to the dispatcher, keeping my tone completely level. "I need police assistance immediately," I said. "I am reporting corporate espionage and an extortion attempt." The perpetrators stole classified financial data and dropped the blackmail demands on my front porch. "I have the physical evidence here." The dispatcher assured me officers were on the way and instructed me not to touch the evidence. I ended the call and set the phone down. A dark realization formed in my mind. The security vault at my brokerage required dual authentication. It needed a physical keycard and a digital passcode. My parents did not have access to either. My home office was always locked. My parents had not visited my house in over 4 months. They could not have obtained these items alone. Someone on the inside had to have helped them. Someone who had unrestricted access to both my business and my home. Someone who knew my routines, my hiding spots, and my vulnerabilities. The front door lock clicked heavily. I heard the familiar sound of a briefcase dropping onto the floor mat, followed by the rustle of a heavy wool coat being taken off. "Fiona, I am home," a voice called out. It was my husband, Connor. He walked into the kitchen, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw me. His eyes darted from my face to the open silver box, then to the shredded parchment and encrypted drives. He did not ask what the box was. Instead, a look of sheer panic washed over his features. The color drained from his face. Before he could speak, the sound of approaching sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed through the large front windows, casting frantic shadows across the walls. Connor's gaze shifted to the flashing lights outside and then back to the evidence. He took a stumbling step backward, his hands shaking. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," he stammered, his voice barely more than a terrified whisper. The puzzle pieces snapped together. My parents had not acted alone. The person I slept next to had handed them the keys to my destruction. A heavy knock shattered the silence. "Chicago police, open up," a voice shouted. Connor stood frozen. His jaw worked silently. The betrayal radiating from him was palpable. I had trusted this man with my deepest insecurities. He knew how hard I had worked to build an independent life. Now he was complicit in the very nightmare I had tried to escape. I walked past him and opened the front door. 2 police officers stood waiting. "I am Fiona," I said, stepping aside. "The evidence is in the kitchen." The officers stepped inside. They immediately noticed Connor, who looked like a trapped animal. The safe, secure life I had meticulously built had been an illusion. The real conflict was only just beginning, and the first enemy I had to face was the man standing in my kitchen. Officer Caldwell, a tall man with sharp, observant eyes, took the lead. He walked slowly toward the kitchen island, his gaze sweeping over the perfectly wrapped silver box, the black encrypted drives, and the shredded remains of my grandfather's will. His partner, Officer Miller, stayed closer to the entryway, keeping a watchful eye on Connor. The air in the room was thick and suffocating. Connor was still frozen near the edge of the kitchen, his face completely drained of color. He looked exactly like a man who had just watched his entire life collapse in front of him. Caldwell pulled a small notepad and a pair of latex gloves from his uniform pockets. He carefully put the gloves on before leaning in to inspect the threatening note my mother had written. He read the words in silence, then looked up at me. He said, his voice calm and steady. "You mentioned on the phone that this was an extortion attempt involving corporate espionage. Can you explain exactly what these drives are and how they ended up on your kitchen counter?" I pointed directly at Connor, my hand completely steady. "You should ask him," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "He is the only other person on Earth who had the security clearance to access that data." Connor flinched as if I had struck him physically. He raised his hands, palms facing outward in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Fiona, please," he stammered, taking a tentative step toward me. "You are taking this entirely the wrong way. It is a misunderstanding, a massive misunderstanding. There is no extortion happening here. Your mother was just being dramatic with that note. You know how she gets when she wants to make a point." Officer Caldwell turned his attention to my husband. His expression hardened into something far more clinical and probing. "Sir," Caldwell said, stepping between Connor and me, "when we walked up to the house, we heard you say, 'Please do not tell me they actually did it.' What exactly were you referring to?" Connor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at the police officers, then at me, his eyes pleading for a lifeline I had absolutely no intention of throwing him. He tugged at the collar of his shirt, suddenly sweating despite the cool morning air. I just meant the prank, he lied, his voice cracking slightly. Her parents have a strange sense of humor. They like to play practical jokes. It is a family dynamic thing. A prank, I repeated, letting the word hang in the quiet kitchen. You think stealing confidential financial portfolios from a dual authentication vault is a practical joke. You think breaking into my home to shred my grandfather's legal documents is a prank. Connor, I want you to look at these police officers and tell them exactly how my parents bypassed the biometric scanner and the 64-character encryption sequence on my office mainframe. Because unless my mother suddenly became an elite hacker overnight, someone handed her the keys to my business. Connor looked away from me, unable to hold my gaze. He stared at the hardwood floor, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Officer Miller stepped forward slightly, placing a hand on his utility belt. Mr. Vance Caldwell said, his tone dropping an octave. This is a very serious situation. We are looking at grand larceny, breaking and entering, and extortion. If you have information about how these items were removed from a secure facility, you need to tell us right now. Lying to us will only make you an accessory to a felony. The threat of prison time finally broke through Connor's practiced corporate composure. His shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, shaky breath. Okay, he mumbled, rubbing his hands over his face. Okay. Nobody broke into your office, Fiona. I let them in. I gave Harrison the digital passcodes. But it was not a theft. I swear to you, it was not a theft. He promised me they only wanted to look at the list. They just wanted to borrow the contact information. I felt a cold knot twist deep in my stomach. You gave my father the vault codes, I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You handed him the financial data of international estate collectors, politicians, and tech founders, people who trust me with millions of dollars. You gave that to Harrison. Connor took another step toward me, his tone suddenly shifting from panic to condescension. He tried to project the soothing, reasonable voice he always used when he wanted to make me feel small. Fiona, you are blowing this way out of proportion. You are acting hysterical over a simple favor. Your sister is in trouble. Whitney is drowning. Her luxury concierge app is burning through cash, and she is weeks away from declaring bankruptcy. She just needed a lifeline. I stared at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust. My sister Whitney had launched 3 different lifestyle businesses in the past 10 years. My parents had funded every single one of them, pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into her vain attempts to become a celebrity entrepreneur. Each business had failed spectacularly due to her laziness and entitlement, and now they were willing to sacrifice my entire career to save her 4th attempt. A lifeline, I echoed. So your solution was to give them my client roster. You thought they could just spam my elite buyers to beg for venture capital funding. Connor let out an exasperated sigh, acting as if I was the one being unreasonable. Yes, Fiona. They just wanted to send a few emails. Harrison asked me for the list last week. He said Whitney needed access to high-net-worth individuals to secure her next round of funding. He promised they would not copy the actual financial data. They just wanted the names and email addresses. You are being completely selfish. She is your sister. You have all these wealthy connections and you refuse to share them. We are family. Families help each other. I shook my head slowly, marveling at the pure delusion standing in front of me. You do not borrow a client list, Connor. That is a massive violation of federal privacy laws. It is a breach of fiduciary duty. If those names get out, my brokerage is finished. I will be sued into oblivion and I will lose my license. You knew this. You are a financial consultant. You know exactly what kind of legal peril you put me in. Connor crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tightening. He was doubling down on the gaslighting, trying to make me doubt my own reality. You are always so paranoid, Fiona. You always think everyone is out to get you. Your parents love you. They do not want to ruin your business. They just want you to be a team player for once. If you would just help Whitney voluntarily, they would not have to go to these extremes. This is exactly what your mother meant by not making a scene. You are overreacting and trying to turn a family favor into a criminal investigation. Officer Caldwell interrupted the ridiculous tirade by holding up a clear plastic evidence bag containing the threatening note my mother had written. "Sir, I am going to respectfully stop you right there," Caldwell said, his voice firm. "This is extortion." Caldwell signaled to his partner. "Officer Miller, step into the living room with Mr. Vance. We need to separate the two parties." Connor reached a hand out toward me. "Fiona, you cannot let them do this," he pleaded. "Tell them this is just a family dispute." I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 6 years and felt absolutely nothing. "Follow the officer, Connor," I said. "You wanted to help my family so badly. Now you get to explain exactly how you did it." Officer Miller guided a shaking Connor through the arched doorway, leaving me alone in the kitchen with Detective Caldwell. The detective clicked his pen. "All right," Fiona Caldwell said softly. "Extortion of this magnitude does not just happen overnight. Why would your own parents go to these lengths to force you to sign over a commercial property?" I leaned against the cool quartz countertop. "To understand what is happening right now, you have to understand my sister Whitney," I explained. "My parents Harrison and Joanne have spent their entire lives treating my accomplishments as a bank account to fund Whitney's failures. Whitney is the golden child. The only problem is that she has never actually earned a single dime on her own." Caldwell completely stopped writing. "And they use you to subsidize her lifestyle." I nodded. "When I was 22, I won a highly competitive small business grant. My parents forged my signature on the withdrawal slips and used the money to pay for Whitney's destination wedding in Tuscany. When I confronted them, my father told me I was being selfish. The marriage lasted 8 months. The debt they put me in took 4 years to pay off." Caldwell stopped writing. "They stole your business capital to pay for a wedding. Why did not you press charges back then?" "Because I was young, and I still believed they might actually love me," I said. "I thought if I just worked harder, they would finally respect me." When our grandfather passed away, he bypassed my parents entirely. He left me his private collection of antiquities. It was the seed money for the brokerage I run today. Whitney, on the other hand, has launched and crashed 4 different lifestyle brands. Her current venture is a luxury concierge application. It is hemorrhaging money. She needs a physical flagship location to secure a new round of venture capital funding. I pointed to the silver box on the counter. "My brokerage operates out of a prime $2 million building. I own the deed outright. My parents want me to sign it over to Whitney so she can use my real estate as collateral for her failing app. They know I would never do it voluntarily, so they stole my client data to force my hand." Caldwell slowly shook his head. "Extorting your own child to fund a failing business venture. But your husband had the access codes. Why on earth would he help them?" Before I could answer, a sudden shout echoed from the living room. "I am not a criminal," Connor yelled at Officer Miller. "You do not understand the pressure I was under. Harrison promised he would fix it. He promised me a clean slate." Caldwell and I stepped quietly toward the arched doorway, listening to the interrogation. "Fix what, Mr. Vance?" Officer Miller calmly asked. "Exactly what did Harrison Wilson promise to fix in exchange for the security codes to your wife's firm?" Connor was pacing the length of the living room rug. "The stock market," he blurted out. "The day trading accounts. I was heavily leveraged. I took out margin loans thinking I could double the returns on a tech IPO. The stock tanked. The margin calls came due all at once. I was down $400,000. The brokers were going to place a lien on our house." I grabbed the edge of the doorframe to steady myself. While I was out working 80-hour weeks flying across the country to source rare, beautiful antiquities, my husband was secretly gambling away our financial security. I did not know what to do. Connor continued, his voice cracking into a sob. "I could not tell Fiona. She would have divorced me on the spot." Then Harrison approached me. He noticed I was moving money around from our joint savings. He confronted me at a golf luncheon. He told me he knew about the debt. "And he offered you a deal," Caldwell said, stepping fully into the living room. "He offered to pay off your day trading debt if you gave him the keys to the kingdom." Connor jumped, spinning around to face Caldwell. Tears were streaming down his face now. "Yes," he loudly cried out. Harrison said Whitney just needed a little leverage to get the gallery deed. He wired the $400,000 to my offshore trading account last Thursday. All I had to do was give him the administrative passwords and the physical keycard for one night. I did not know they were going to steal the client portfolios. I did not know they would shred her grandfather's will. I just wanted to be free of the debt. I stepped into the living room. Connor suddenly saw me and visibly flinched, crumbling inward like a deflated balloon. "You sold my entire life for $400,000. I said, my voice cold and hollow. "You handed my parents the weapon to destroy my business because you were too much of a coward to admit you had a gambling problem." Connor dropped to his knees right there on the Persian rug. "Fiona, please forgive me," he begged. "I can fix this. We can talk to Harrison. We can make a deal with him. Do not let them arrest me. I am your husband." Caldwell did not hesitate. He gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Cuff him," Caldwell ordered. Miller stepped forward, grabbing Connor's wrist and twisting his arm smoothly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed through the silent house. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Connor Vance Caldwell recited, "You are under arrest for accessory to extortion, corporate theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Miller hauled him up, Connor realized that crying and begging were not going to work. The panic in his eyes instantly morphed into a cornered, vicious rage. The mask fell away, revealing the pathetic, spiteful man he truly was. He dug his heels into the carpet, resisting the officer's grip as they marched him toward the front door. "You are making a huge mistake," Fiona Connor screamed, his face turning a mottled red. "You have no idea who you are messing with. You do not know what Whitney has waiting for you." I stood perfectly still, watching him struggle. "What are you talking about, Connor?" He laughed, a harsh, manic sound that bounced off the foyer walls. "Whitney's new fiancé." Connor sneered, struggling against the handcuffs as they dragged him outside. "Did your mother conveniently forget to mention him in her little gift box? She is engaged to Richard Sterling. He is a corporate liquidator, Fiona. A shark. If you do not drop these charges, he will destroy you in court. He will strip you to the bone. You will lose everything." The battle lines were now clearly drawn for the long war ahead. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, cutting off the sound of Connor's frantic voice. The sudden silence in my house was absolute and suffocating. I stood alone in the foyer, staring at the empty space on the Persian rug where my husband of 6 years had just knelt and confessed to selling my livelihood. The faint wail of the police cruiser's siren faded into the distance, taking him away. I walked back into the kitchen. The silver gift box still sat on the island, the shredded pieces of my grandfather's will scattered across the quartz countertop like dirty snow. I felt completely hollowed out. Before I could even begin to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, my cell phone vibrated against the marble counter. The screen illuminated with a blocked caller ID. I knew exactly who it was. I considered letting it go to voicemail, letting the police handle everything from this point forward. But a cold, rigid anchor had taken hold in my chest. I wanted to hear him say it. I needed to hear the sound of the voice of the man who had orchestrated the destruction of my marriage and my business. I swiped the screen to accept the call and lifted the phone to my ear without saying a single word. "Are you out of your mind?" The voice of my father Harrison boomed through the speaker. He was apoplectic, his breath coming in sharp, angry bursts. "I just got a frantic call from Connor's lawyer. You actually had him arrested. You brought the police into this. What is wrong with you, Fiona? Have you completely lost your grip on reality?" I gripped the edge of the kitchen island, my knuckles turning white. "You broke into my home, Dad. You stole classified corporate data. You shredded Grandpa's will. That is not a family dispute. That is a string of felonies." "Oh, stop being so dramatic," Harrison snapped, utterly dismissing the gravity of his actions. "Nobody broke into anything. Your husband let us in. He opened the vault voluntarily. We did not steal a single thing. We made digital copies of a client list. That is networking, Fiona. That is just business. And as for that ancient piece of paper from your grandfather, I was doing you a huge favor. You have been clinging to the past for far too long. It is time you started looking at the future of this family, instead of just looking out for yourself. The future of this family, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You mean Whitney? Yes, I mean Whitney, he said, his tone shifting into the patronizing cadence he had used to manage me since I was a little girl. He always spoke to me as if I were an ungrateful employee rather than his daughter. She is finally making real moves, Fiona. She is marrying Richard Sterling. Do you have any idea what kind of doors Richard can open for her? For all of us. But Richard is a man who respects tangible assets. He expects his future wife to bring something substantial to the marriage. Whitney's concierge application is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. She just needs the right optical presentation. She needs a flagship office in a premier location to host venture capitalists and show Richard she is a serious player. And you decided my gallery was the perfect sacrifice, I said, feeling the bile rise in my throat. Sacrifice, Harrison scoffed loudly. Let us be completely honest with each other for once, Fiona. You do not need a $2 million commercial property in the arts district to do what you do. You are a glorified pawn shop owner. You flip old vases and dusty paintings to bored rich people. You can do that from a rented warehouse in the suburbs. Whitney is building a technology empire. She needs that real estate. She needs the prestige. You owe this to your sister. You owe this to the family that raised you. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer toxicity of his words. For 33 years, this had been his tactic. He weaponized my childhood insecurities at every turn. Whenever I achieved something, he diminished it. Whenever Whitney failed, he demanded I subsidize her recovery. He wanted me to feel small so Whitney could feel big. I do not owe you anything, I told him, my voice remarkably steady. And I am not signing my property over to Whitney. You have nothing left to bargain with. The police have the flash drives. Connor is in a holding cell. It is over. A low, dark chuckle echoed through the phone. It was a sound completely devoid of paternal affection. You really think I am that stupid, Fiona Harrison? Asked, his voice dropping into a cold, menacing register. You think I would give Connor the only copies of the data to drop on your porch? Those drives were just a prop, a visual aid to make sure you understood we were serious. I have the master files secured on a remote server. Every bank account number, every private acquisition, every hidden asset your clients trust you to keep confidential. The blood roared in my ears. If you leak that, I said, struggling to keep my voice from shaking, you will go to federal prison. They have to prove I did it first, he replied smoothly. And they never will. It will be an anonymous leak to the financial press. A massive data breach from an insecure, poorly managed antiquities brokerage. Your clients will sue you into bankruptcy. The state will strip your licenses. You will be ruined, Fiona. Destitute. And Connor will make sure you get absolutely nothing in the divorce. I stood frozen, the reality of his threats sinking into my bones. He had thought of everything. He had weaponized my entire existence. He was willing to scorch the earth and destroy his own daughter's life just to secure an office space for his favorite child. What do you want? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I want you to stop acting like a spoiled, jealous sister, Harrison demanded. I want you to call the police and tell them you made a mistake. Tell them Connor was authorized to take those drives. Then you are going to call your attorney and have the deed to the gallery transferred into a new holding company under Whitney's name. You have exactly 48 hours. 48 hours, I repeated numbly. We are hosting a charity dinner this Friday at the country club. Harrison said, his tone returning to a breezy conversational cadence, as if he were not actively blackmailing his own flesh and blood. You will bring the signed transfer papers to the dinner. You will hand them to Whitney, and you will smile, and you will congratulate her on her new flagship office. If you do not show up, or if you try to pull another stunt with the police, I will hit send on those files before the appetizers are served. Do you understand me, Fiona? I did not answer. The sheer audacity of his demands left me momentarily speechless. 48 hours, he repeated sharply. Leave the business to the adults. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, the dial tone ringing in the empty kitchen. I looked around at my beautiful home, the life I had built piece by piece, dollar by dollar, away from their toxic influence. They wanted to take it all and hand it to Whitney on a silver platter. They expected me to simply roll over and disappear into the background just like I always did when we were kids. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up the thick cream-colored card my mother had written. Do not make a scene. My father believed he had me completely boxed in. He believed the threat of public ruin would paralyze me into submission. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the daughter he had spent a lifetime underestimating. I set the heavy cream-colored card down on the cold marble counter and slowly backed away from the center of the kitchen island. I did not pick up my phone to call Detective Caldwell and beg him to undo the damage. I did not call my corporate attorney to begin drafting property transfer documents to hand my life over to my sister. Instead, I walked over to the coffee maker and brewed a fresh pot, watching the morning sun climb higher over the Chicago skyline. The 48-hour clock my father had set was officially ticking, and I decided right then and there to just let it run. My silence was my definitive answer. I knew Harrison would not take my defiance lightly, but I severely underestimated the sheer speed and the viciously calculated nature of my mother's retaliation. I thought they would wait for the deadline to pass. I thought they would attack my business directly. I did not expect them to attack my sanity. It started the very next morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at the empty bar stool where my husband used to eat his breakfast when my cell phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. And again. Within 30 seconds, a steady, continuous vibration rattled the device against the hard quartz countertop. I picked it up to see a massive flood of notifications pouring in from every social media platform I possessed. My cousin Sarah had tagged me in a public post. Then my Aunt Linda tagged me. Then a dozen other extended family members shared the exact same link. I tapped on the very first notification, and a video immediately began to play on my screen. It was my mother. Joanne was sitting on the plush cream-colored sofa in her formal living room, wearing a modest beige cardigan and absolutely no makeup. Her hair was purposefully unstyled and slightly disheveled. She looked directly into the camera lens and let out a broken, trembling sigh. To all our dear family and friends, she began, her voice catching perfectly on the second syllable. I am making this video today because we are in a state of absolute heartbreak and we desperately need your prayers. She paused to press a crumpled tissue to her eyes, wiping away tears that did not exist. As many of you know, my eldest daughter Fiona has been under a tremendous amount of stress lately. Her business is failing. She is drowning in debt. And sadly, her marriage to Connor has completely collapsed. The lies flowed from her mouth with a chilling, practiced ease. Joanne looked straight into the camera, acting the part of the devastated, weary matriarch to absolute perfection. The pressure has simply been too much for her fragile mind to bear. Joanne continued, her voice cracking into a heavy sob. Yesterday, Fiona suffered a severe psychiatric breakdown. She became completely unhinged and delusional. She actually called the police and falsely accused her own father of theft. She had her innocent husband arrested to cover up her own financial failures and erratic behavior. I sat completely frozen, listening to my mother weave a masterpiece of public manipulation. She did not just paint me as a liar, she painted me as a tragedy. She weaponized my privacy and weaponized the stigma of mental illness to protect her favorite child. We have tried absolutely everything to get Fiona the psychiatric help she so desperately needs, Joanne whispered, staring mournfully at the camera. We have begged her to seek treatment. But in her delusion, she has turned her paranoia against the very people who love her most. She is lashing out at her sister Whitney out of pure spite and deep-seated jealousy. Please, I beg of you, do not judge Fiona for the terrible, destructive things she is doing right now. She is sick. We only ask for your prayers that she finds her way back to reality. The video ended with my mother burying her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I stared at the dark screen, my chest tight with a suffocating heavy weight. She had not just threatened my business, she had preemptively destroyed my credibility. If I tried to defend myself, I would just look exactly like the unhinged, paranoid woman she claimed I was. The comments under the video were a sickening chorus of sympathy for my brave mother and prayers for my poor, broken mind. But the text messages flooding my phone directly were not sympathetic at all. They were brutal. My Aunt Carol was the very first to send a direct message. "I am absolutely disgusted by you, Fiona. How could you put your parents through this public nightmare after everything they have sacrificed for you? You need to drop these ridiculous fake charges against Connor and your father immediately and get yourself checked into a hospital." Before I could even process the vitriol of that message, another notification popped up. This one was from my cousin Greg. "You have always been insanely jealous of Whitney, but having innocent people arrested just to cover up your bankrupt business is a brand new low. You are toxic. Stay far away from the rest of the family until you are properly medicated." The screen blurred as message after message poured into my inbox. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people I had shared Thanksgiving dinners with for 3 decades, people whose weddings I had attended, whose children I had bought gifts for. They all turned on me in a matter of hours. Not a single person picked up the phone to call me and ask for my side of the story. Not one relative paused for a moment to question if my mother's tearful performance might actually be a carefully orchestrated lie designed to protect a criminal. They simply swallowed the completely fabricated narrative that I was a jealous, spiteful sister losing my grip on reality. They demanded I apologize to Whitney for trying to ruin her happiness and her future. They demanded I drop all the criminal charges and immediately beg for my parents' forgiveness. The social isolation was immediate and it was completely absolute. I was entirely cut off from the only family network I had ever known since I was a little girl. My mother had effectively built an impenetrable brick wall around me, ensuring that if I spoke out, I would be screaming into a void. Anyone who listened would naturally view my claims as the wild ramblings of a sick, bitter woman having a nervous breakdown. I set the phone face down on the kitchen island and walked slowly into the living room. The silence of the large house pressed in on me, heavy and absolute. Connor was sitting in a cold jail cell facing multiple serious felony charges. My parents were officially my worst enemies. My entire extended family viewed me as a psychiatric case study who needed to be locked away permanently. I had never felt so entirely alone in my entire life. They had successfully backed me into a dark corner, stripping away my support system piece by piece, until there was nothing left but me and the empty walls. They thought this severe isolation would break my spirit. They also thought the shame of public humiliation would force me to quietly sign away my property and beg for their mercy. They desperately wanted me to feel utterly powerless so that I would surrender my life to save my sister. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my surrender. I pushed myself off the living room wall and took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the empty house fill my lungs. The smear campaign was a distraction. It was a loud, obnoxious circus designed to keep me panicked and off balance while they held my actual livelihood hostage. I needed to move, and I needed to move right now. If Harrison had the digital portfolios secured on a remote server, he might still be looking for blind spots in my network to exploit. I had to lock down the central mainframe at my gallery before he could do any more damage. I walked briskly down the hallway to my home office, shutting the heavy oak door behind me, as if trying to barricade myself against the chaos outside. I sat down at my glass desk and opened my laptop. My hands were trembling slightly as I typed in my administrative password to connect to the gallery's secure virtual private network. The screen blinked, confirming the connection was established. I let out a small breath of relief. I still had a lifeline to my business. My first priority was to sever Connor's administrative access. He had held a secondary clearance level to help manage the accounting and payroll software. It was a remnant of trust from early in our marriage, back when I foolishly believed we were building a life together as partners. I clicked on the directory for the master server, intending to revoke his permissions and initiate a forced global logout. The screen hung for a fraction of a second. Then a harsh red dialog box snapped into the center of the display. Access denied. I frowned, staring at the bold text. I typed my password again, making sure to hit every key with deliberate precision. I hit enter. Access denied. A cold sweat began to prickle along my hairline. That was impossible. I was the founding owner and the primary systems administrator. I wrote the foundational security protocols myself when I opened the brokerage. I pulled up the secondary access portal and typed in my emergency bypass sequence. It was a 64-character alphanumeric string that I had memorized specifically for catastrophic network failures. The progress bar spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Invalid credentials. Account locked. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The cold sweat turned into an icy wave that washed entirely over my body. I frantically clicked on the recovery link navigating to the back-end diagnostic log to see exactly what was rejecting my administrative override. The log loaded rendering lines of green text against a black background. I traced the most recent administrative changes. At 2 in the morning, while Connor was pacing the floor in our bedroom pretending to be anxious about a random work project his credentials had been used to access the core root directory. But he had not just downloaded the client financial portfolios for my father. The diagnostic log showed a secondary transfer of administrative rights. Connor's account had granted full supreme master control to a brand new external user profile. And that external user had immediately changed every single firewall password, revoked my biometric clearance, and locked down the entire mainframe. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. They had not just taken copies of my files. They had stolen the digital infrastructure of my entire company. The gallery was functionally paralyzed. I could not access my bank accounts. I could not process client payments. I could not even open the digital lockboxes that held the physical antiquities in the downtown vault. I was completely and utterly locked out of the business I had spent a decade building from nothing. The sheer scale of the betrayal threatened to pull me under. My husband, the man who kissed my forehead every morning and asked about my day, had sat in the dark and handed the keys to my kingdom over to my sister. He had watched me pour my blood and sweat into every single acquisition. He knew how hard I fought to earn the trust of elite international collectors who demanded absolute discretion. He knew that this brokerage was not just a job to me, it was my sanctuary. It was the only thing in my life that belonged entirely to me, untouched by my parents' manipulation. And Connor had traded it away to cover his own pathetic gambling debts. I stared at the blinking cursor on the locked screen, feeling a profound sense of vertigo. I was trapped. Harrison had the client list to blackmail me, and now Whitney had the master keys to hold the physical gallery hostage. They had planned this with terrifying precision. They knew exactly how to isolate me digitally and socially, leaving me with absolutely no avenue for escape or retaliation. The silence of my home office was broken by the sharp chime of my cell phone resting on the glass desk. I flinched at the sound. I stared at the device, watching the screen light up with a new text message. I did not want to look. I wanted to throw the phone against the wall and shatter it into 100 pieces. But the dread sitting heavy in my stomach demanded I read it. I reached out and picked up the phone. The message was from Whitney. "TikTok sis." I read the 3 words and felt a fresh wave of nausea hit me. I opened the message thread. "Sign the transfer deed at the family charity dinner on Friday, or the entire mainframe gets wiped. Leave the business to the adults." I dropped the phone onto the desk as if it had physically burned me. I gripped the edges of the glass surface, my knuckles turning stark white. The sheer arrogance of her demand was suffocating. Leave the business to the adults. Whitney had never worked a 40-hour week in her entire life. She had never stayed up until 3 in the morning balancing ledgers or negotiating with difficult vendors. She simply expected the fruits of my labor to be handed to her because she had always been handed whatever she desired. I sat in the quiet room, the reality of my situation closing around me like a vice. I was completely boxed in from every conceivable angle. If I went to the police with the cybercrime, my father would carry out his threat to anonymously leak the client portfolios to the financial press. My reputation would be destroyed, my licenses revoked, and I would be sued into oblivion by furious wealthy collectors. If I tried to hire a cybersecurity firm to hack back into my own mainframe, Whitney would see the breach attempt and simply wipe the servers clean. All of my acquisition history's authentication certificates and legal contracts would be permanently deleted. They held every piece of my life in their hands. My marriage was a casualty of Connor's cowardly greed. My family was a pack of wolves tearing me apart. My business was moments away from total annihilation. I rested my forehead against the cool glass desk. They wanted me to walk into that charity dinner and surrender. They believed they had cornered a scared little girl. They did not realize I had spent a decade surviving. I was not going to smile for their cameras. I would never surrender. I closed the lid of my laptop with a soft click. My phone was vibrating on the glass desk as another wave of vicious text messages poured in from my aunts and cousins. I picked up the device, navigated to the settings menu, and turned it off completely. The sudden total silence in my home office was glorious. I was not going to play their game. I was not going to post a tearful video defending my sanity or engage in a pathetic public mudslinging match with my mother. I would not text my father to beg for more time. I would not send a single word to my sister. Silence was the one response they had not anticipated, and it would drive them absolutely insane. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to panic. I was going to give them nothing but a ghost. I stood up and walked into my master bedroom. I bypassed the casual clothes I usually wore for gallery installations and went straight to the back of my closet. I pulled out a tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and my sharpest black heels. I dressed with meticulous care, pulling my hair back into a sleek, tight twist. I applied my makeup with clinical precision, masking the exhaustion under my eyes and highlighting the sharp angles of my cheekbones. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I did not see the hysterical, broken woman my mother had just described to the world. I saw a woman preparing to dismantle her enemies piece by piece. I grabbed my leather briefcase and walked out of the house, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I drove downtown, navigating the bustling city streets with complete focus. My destination was a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. It housed the offices of Sterling and Associates, one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in the state. The senior partner, Marcus Sterling, had represented my brokerage for the past 5 years. He was a shark in a $3,000 suit, a man who specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate defense. He also happened to be the uncle of Richard Sterling, the very man my sister was currently engaged to. It was a detail my parents had completely overlooked when they decided to threaten me with Richard's name. They assumed I was just a naive shop owner, completely disconnected from the heavy hitters of the corporate world. They had no idea I had been paying Marcus Sterling a substantial retainer for half a decade. I stepped off the elevator onto the 60th floor. The receptionist recognized me immediately and ushered me straight back to Marcus's corner office. Marcus was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city skyline. He turned as I walked in, his sharp gray eyes instantly assessing my rigid posture. "Fiona," he said, gesturing to the leather chairs positioned in front of his massive mahogany desk. "Sit down. You look like you are about to declare a corporate war." "I am," I replied, taking the seat and placing my briefcase on my lap. "I need to invoke every single defensive protocol we have established for the brokerage." Marcus sat down across from me. "Tell me exactly what happened," he instructed. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. I slid the printed photographs across the polished wood surface. The first image was a clear picture of the extortion note my mother had left on my kitchen island. The second was a photo of the shredded remains of my grandfather's will. The third and fourth images were printed screenshots of the digital lockout warnings from my home office computer, showing that the master administrative passwords to my gallery's mainframe had been altered by an external user. Marcus leaned forward, picking up the photographs one by one. His expression remained completely stoic, but his eyes narrowed as he read the extortion note. He set the papers down and looked at me. "This is extortion, grand larceny, and corporate espionage," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Who executed the digital lockout?" My sister Whitney, I answered smoothly. With the help of my parents Harrison and Joanne, they used my husband Connor to physically bypass the biometric locks at the gallery and steal the primary hard drives containing my elite client financial portfolios. Connor confessed to everything this morning. The police have already arrested him. My father just gave me a 48-hour ultimatum. If I do not sign the deed of my $2 million gallery over to Whitney at the charity gala this Friday, he is going to leak the client portfolios to the financial press and ruin my brokerage. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at me with a mix of professional outrage and deep curiosity. They stole your client data and locked you out of your own mainframe to blackmail you out of your real estate, he summarized. Fiona, this is a catastrophic breach. If they leak those portfolios, your clients will tear you apart in civil court. We need to file an emergency injunction immediately to freeze their assets, and we need to bring in a cybersecurity team to try and regain control of your servers before your sister can delete your operational history. I sat perfectly still, letting his words wash over me. I simply looked at my high-powered attorney and offered him a small, cold smile. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, measured register. You do not need to call a cybersecurity team, and we are not going to file an emergency injunction. Not yet. He frowned, clearly taken aback by my lack of panic. Fiona, you are completely locked out of your business. Your sister holds the administrative keys. They have your data. You are entirely boxed in. No, I am not, I replied. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on his desk. I suspected Connor was compromised 7 months ago. Marcus froze. You knew about this. I knew Connor was a liability, I clarified. 7 months ago, I noticed strange discrepancies in his personal financial accounts. Small amounts of money were moving from our joint savings into offshore day trading platforms. I hired a private forensic accountant to quietly track his activity. I watched him leverage margin loans to chase volatile tech stocks. I watched him lose $400,000 in the span of 3 weeks. I knew he was drowning in debt, and I knew he was far too proud and far too cowardly to ever confess it to me. I knew that a man backed into a corner with $500,000 in hidden debt would eventually look for a way out. I knew he had secondary clearance to my gallery's basic accounting software. So I prepared for the worst-case scenario. Marcus stared at me, his gray eyes widening slightly as the pieces began to click into place. What exactly did you do to prepare, Fiona? 5 months ago, I told him, keeping my tone completely conversational. I physically separated the entire gallery's network. I hired an independent tech firm to build a completely new encrypted mainframe. I safely migrated every single genuine client portfolio onto that brand new secure operational server. I am the only person alive who holds the biometric keys to access those specific hidden legal files. Marcus sat in absolute silence for a long moment. The faint hum of the city traffic 60 floors below was the only sound in the expansive office. He slowly steepled his fingers, resting his chin against them, as his sharp gray eyes searched my face. He was looking for any crack in my composure, any sign that I was bluffing or exaggerating the extent of my contingency plan. When he found nothing but cold, hard certainty, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator who had just realized his client was holding a loaded gun under the table. You built a ghost server, he said, his voice laced with a mixture of professional respect and sheer disbelief. You essentially let your husband break into an empty house. Not completely empty, I corrected him, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from my charcoal gray skirt. If Connor had logged in and found absolutely nothing, he would have panicked and alerted my father immediately. They would have known I was onto them. So I left the old architecture intact. I populated the legacy server with dummy files. I spent weeks personally typing out those documents. I created hundreds of realistic-looking portfolios, complete with fake client names, randomly generated offshore account numbers, and entirely fabricated acquisition histories for artifacts that do not even exist. I even threw in a few slightly embarrassing but entirely legal accounting errors, just to make the financial records look authentic. It was enough data to look like a gold mine to a desperate man trying to clear his gambling debts, but it is completely legally and financially worthless. Marcus let out a low whistle, shaking his head. He leaned forward, picking up the printed screenshot of the lockout warning again. So when your sister Whitney changed the master passwords and locked you out of the system, she was essentially locking the doors to a burning building after all the valuables had already been removed. Exactly, I said. They think they have a knife to my throat. They believe they hold the power to completely destroy my reputation by leaking those files to the press. But if my father actually attempts to release those portfolios, he will be handing the financial authorities a massive stack of meaningless digital garbage. Marcus set the paper down and steepled his fingers once more. The implications of this are staggering, Fiona. Your father has committed federal extortion based on stolen property that does not actually exist in the way he believes it does. Your husband has committed corporate espionage and cyber theft. Your sister is an accessory to all of it. We have them dead to rights on multiple felony charges. I know I said keeping my voice perfectly level, but I do not just want to file a police report, Marcus. A quiet arrest sweeps this under the rug. My parents have spent their entire lives sweeping their ugly behavior under the rug, using their wealth and their social standing to avoid any real consequences. If we just hand this over to the authorities, my mother will spin a narrative about a misunderstanding. My father will hire a team of expensive defense attorneys to drag it out in court for years. They will paint me as the vindictive daughter trying to ruin them over a simple family dispute. I want them to face a consequence they cannot buy their way out of. I want them to expose themselves. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with a renewed intensity. He understood exactly what I was asking for. You want to execute the trap at the family charity dinner this Friday, he said, stating it as a fact rather than a question. Yes, I replied. My mother has spent the last 48 hours parading her fake grief all over social media, telling everyone who will listen that her eldest daughter has lost her mind. She has invited every major socialite politician and business leader in the city to this charity gala. It is her crowning event of the season. She wants me to show up broken and humiliated and sign away my life's work in the middle of her precious party to save myself from total ruin. She expects me to quietly hand the keys to Whitney while she smiles for the cameras. And what exactly do you want to hand them instead? Marcus asked, a dangerous glint appearing in his eyes. I reached into my leather briefcase and placed a blank legal pad and a silver pen on the desk between us. A transfer package, I said, but not a forged deed and not a confession hidden behind misleading language. I want a document that uses the public trade name of my gallery on the cover page while legally transferring only the legacy holding company they have already seized. The real building authentic inventory, international licenses, and genuine client records must remain completely outside the transaction. Marcus pulled the pad closer. And Whitney must sign as the acquiring party. Yes, my signature alone will not be enough. She must personally acknowledge that she is accepting control of the legacy entity, its accounts, its servers, and every obligation attached to it. Marcus studied my face. You said the old system contains fabricated client portfolios. Does it contain anything else? That was the one detail I had deliberately saved for last. The legacy system is not clean, I said. The dummy portfolios are harmless, but Connor used the old corporate credentials to conceal something very real. Marcus slowly set down his pen. What did he do? When my forensic accountant began tracing the money disappearing from our joint accounts, she found more than margin loans. Connor had opened a series of high-interest credit facilities through offshore lenders. He used the gallery's former operating company as the named borrower and forged my electronic authorization on several corporate guarantees. By the time I discovered the full structure, the legacy entity was carrying $1.5 million in toxic debt. Marcus stared at me. You never reported the forged guarantees? Not immediately, I replied. Reporting them would have alerted Connor that I was investigating him. Instead, I froze every legitimate account, moved the real business into the new holding company, and placed the disputed loans under continuous legal review. The lenders were notified that the guarantees were being challenged, but the old entity remained technically responsible until a court ruled otherwise. Connor believed the debt was still hidden. My father believed he was paying off only $400,000. Neither of them realized how deep the hole had become. Marcus stood and walked toward the windows, thinking through the structure. So the company your sister seized contains worthless data, no authentic art assets, and a mountain of contested liabilities. Exactly. And your father wants a signed transfer at the gala because Whitney's investors need proof that she controls the gallery. I nodded. They do not merely want access to the server. They need a legal acquisition they can display to the venture capital firm. Marcus turned back toward me. Then, administrative access alone is not enough. Changing a password does not make someone personally liable for corporate debt. Whitney must sign an acceptance document. It must clearly identify the legacy entity, acknowledge immediate control of its systems, and state that she accepts its existing contractual obligations. If she signs only as the recipient of real estate, she may later claim she knew nothing about the company attached to it. That is why I came to you, I said. Marcus returned to his desk and began writing. The cover page can use the gallery's familiar public name, he said. Your family will see exactly what they expect to see, but the legal schedule will identify the transferred asset by its correct corporate registration number. That entity owns the compromised server and the dummy records. It does not own your downtown building, your genuine collection, or the new secure holding company. He drew a line across the pad and added several notes beneath it. Whitney will need to sign twice. The first signature accepts membership and operational control. The second acknowledges the attached schedules, including all disputed debts, pending claims, and digital assets. Harrison should sign as transaction sponsor and guarantor if he insists on presenting the acquisition to her investors. A cold satisfaction settled through me. He will insist. He wants everyone to believe he rescued Whitney by handing her my company. Then let his arrogance create the paper trail, Marcus said. But the document cannot falsely state that they committed a crime. We already have independent evidence of the crime. The purpose of this agreement is to prove what entity they knowingly chose to control after stealing its access credentials. He was right. I did not need to trick them into confessing through a paragraph they had never read. I needed them to place their own signatures beneath an accurate description of the company they were so desperate to possess. We will also need an independent notary, Marcus continued. Someone who can verify the identities, the sequence of signatures, and whether each party claimed to understand the transaction. My father will bring one of his own people. I do not want one of his people. I will arrange for Evelyn Shaw, a mobile notary used by our firm, to be present at the country club under the pretext of closing an urgent commercial transaction. She will remain neutral. She will ask every signer whether they are acting voluntarily and whether they had an opportunity to review the schedules. Whitney will say yes without reading them, I said. That will be her choice, Marcus replied. We are not going to prevent her from reading anything. We are going to give her every opportunity to perform basic due diligence. He looked down at the screenshots of the lockout warnings. Do you have evidence that Whitney personally took control of the server? She texted me from her own phone, I said. She threatened to wipe the entire mainframe unless I transferred the gallery. The forensic team preserved the message, the device information, and every administrative change made after Connor handed over his credentials. Good. That connects her threat to the system. The agreement will connect her signature to the entity. Neither replaces the other. Marcus separated my mother's handwritten note from the digital screenshots and arranged the evidence into 3 piles. One package goes to Detective Caldwell, he said. One remains with my firm. The third stays encrypted with the cyber team. If Harrison tries to upload the dummy portfolios, the monitoring software will preserve the originating device network address, destination, and exact time of transmission. And if he never sends them, we still have the blackmail note, Connor's confession, Whitney's messages, and the bank transfers. The gala is not necessary to prove that the crime occurred. It is necessary to stop your family from hiding behind the claim that this was merely an emotional misunderstanding. That distinction mattered. I was not walking into the country club to manufacture a crime. The crime had already happened. I was giving them one final opportunity to claim ownership of their decisions in front of the investors they intended to deceive. Marcus tapped the legal pad. When you arrive, act exactly as defeated as they expect. Let Harrison describe the transaction in his own words. Do not introduce false facts. Do not pressure Whitney to sign. Place the documents on the table and allow them to decide what they are willing to accept. They will pressure me, I said. I know. Evelyn will document the condition of the room and the order in which everything occurs. If they threaten you again, remain calm. Every word they speak will strengthen the existing case. I looked down at the blackmail note. Do not make a scene. My mother had written those words because she believed silence belonged to her. She thought silence was the cage that would keep me obedient. By Friday night, silence would become the space in which every one of them exposed themselves. Marcus continued writing, his pen moving rapidly across the paper. After the signing, do not leave the country club. Go to the upper balcony overlooking the ballroom. The forensic team will send a presentation file containing the preserved footage, the bank transfers, and the blackmail evidence to a secure drive. Detective Caldwell will decide when there is sufficient cause to execute the warrants. I want the investors to see what they were being asked to finance, I said. They can see authentic evidence, Marcus replied, but Caldwell must approve anything taken from the active investigation. We will coordinate with him before Friday. You are not going to compromise a criminal case for a dramatic reveal. I nodded. The spectacle mattered less than making the truth impossible to erase. Marcus added one final note. There is another practical issue. Your family will expect you to sign first. That is acceptable. Your signature will authorize the transfer only if the acquiring party completes every acceptance line. Until Whitney signs, nothing changes. The instant she signs and the notary seals the document, the legacy entity and its disclosed obligations become hers, including the $1.5 million, including the disputed debt, the compromised server, and every legal problem attached to that company, Marcus confirmed. Your real gallery remains protected under the new holding structure. I imagined Whitney sitting at the head of a private table, too intoxicated by victory to read the schedules placed in front of her. I imagined Harrison ordering her to sign because investors were waiting outside. They had spent their entire lives treating due diligence as something lesser people performed. They believed wealth and confidence could replace caution. Their own habits would finish what my preparation had started. Marcus closed the legal pad. We will have the transfer package, certified corporate schedules, and notarization protocol ready by Friday. The cyber team will maintain the live trace. Caldwell will receive the complete evidence set tomorrow morning. I stood and picked up my briefcase. The crushing weight that had followed me into the office was gone. In its place was a colder, steadier awareness. I finally understood the difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge depended on anger. Accountability depended on records, witnesses, and consequences no one could purchase away. No improvising, Marcus warned as I moved toward the door. Harrison may become dangerous when he realizes he has lost control. I met his eyes. I have spent 33 years watching him lose control whenever anyone told him no. This time, I will not be alone. Marcus gave one firm nod. Go to Caldwell. Give him everything. By Friday night, your family will either walk away from the transaction or sign for exactly what they demanded. I turned toward the door. The plan was no longer a fantasy built out of rage. It was a documented sequence supported by evidence, independent witnesses, and people my family could not intimidate. For the first time since the silver box appeared on my doorstep, I was not reacting to their attack. I was controlling what happened next. I walked out of Marcus Sterling's office and took the elevator to the lobby. I did not go home. Instead, I drove straight to the police precinct, where Detective Caldwell had been holding Connor since the early morning hours. Caldwell was waiting for me in a small, windowless conference room near the back of the precinct. His tie was loosened and several thick manila folders were spread out across the scratched metal table. "Have a seat, Fiona," he said, pointing to the metal folding chair across from him. "We have been busy since you called. Connor has been talking. In fact, he has not stopped talking since we put him in holding. He is terrified. I sat down. Did he admit to the data theft? I asked, my voice steady. He admitted everything, Caldwell replied, sliding a laptop toward the center of the table. He handed over his cloud passcode, hoping for a plea deal. We found the digital trail, but we also found something better. We pulled footage from both your private server room and the underground loading garage. The two camera systems captured the theft and the handoff from different angles. Caldwell tapped the keyboard. A black and white video played showing a timestamp from 3 days ago, just past midnight. The heavy reinforced door to my server room swung open. Connor stepped into the frame wearing a dark hoodie, pulling it up around his face, as if that would somehow hide his identity from the cameras he explicitly knew I had installed. I watched my husband move toward the primary server rack. His hands were shaking as he plugged a small, external hard drive into the port. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Seeing it on a diagnostic log was one thing. Watching the man I had shared a bed with for years physically steal my life's work with such deliberate, calculated movements was entirely different. He was in there for 19 minutes, Caldwell noted, tapping the screen. He downloaded what he thought was your entire client database. We have the physical drive in evidence now. He surrendered it, hoping it would grant him leniency. Let him keep hoping, I said, my tone flat. He committed corporate espionage. Caldwell nodded and closed the laptop. That is not the only thing we found, Fiona. When we subpoenaed his bank records, we were looking for the gambling debts you mentioned. We found those. They are massive. But we also found the funding source keeping him afloat. He opened one of the thick manila folders and pulled out a stack of bank statements. He laid them out in front of me, tracing a line down the page with his pen. Starting 8 months ago, someone began making large, consistent wire transfers into a hidden offshore account under Connor's name. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. It was always just enough to cover his most aggressive margin calls and keep the loan sharks from breaking his legs. I leaned forward, examining the routing numbers. My eyes scanned the originating account information. The offshore shell corporation used to send the funds was heavily layered, but I recognized the primary holding company immediately. It was one of the subsidiary investment firms owned entirely by my father. Harrison was paying him. I whispered, the reality of the conspiracy settling heavily over me. My father was funding his gambling addiction. Caldwell leaned back in his squeaky metal chair, his expression grim. Your father was not just funding the addiction, Fiona. He was financing a corporate spy. He kept Connor desperate enough to stay on the hook, but comfortable enough to remain in your house and access your networks. Connor admitted your father explicitly instructed him to acquire the client portfolios in exchange for wiping his massive debt clean. Your father orchestrated this entire breach. I stared at the bank statements. Harrison had essentially purchased my husband. He weaponized Connor's weakness, turning my marriage into a Trojan horse. The sheer calculated malice took my breath away. This was a long-term strategic operation designed to dismantle me from the inside out. My father paid for the destruction of my life. We have the wire transfers, Caldwell stated firmly. We have the security footage. We have Connor's full signed confession implicating your father and your sister. The district attorney is already reviewing the files. We can move forward with arrest warrants for Harrison and Whitney by the end of the week. I looked up at the detective, feeling that same icy calm I had experienced in Marcus Sterling's office. Do not arrest them yet, detective. If you arrest them now, my mother will claim they are victims of a misunderstanding. She will use her money and her influence to paint me as a vindictive liar. I need them to publicly incriminate themselves. I need them to claim ownership of the theft in front of the very people they are trying to impress. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. You are playing a very dangerous game, Fiona. I am finishing the game they started, I corrected him. I stood up and thanked him for his work, assuring him I would be in touch on Friday night. I drove back to my house. The next 2 days were a blur of intense preparation. I spent hours on secure conference calls with Marcus, refining the property transfer deed. We pored over every single line, ensuring the trap was completely invisible to the naked eye. By Thursday evening, Marcus had finalized the transfer package exactly as planned. The cover page used the gallery's public trade name while the attached schedules transferred only the legacy holding company, the compromised server, and its disclosed liabilities. The agreement would become effective only after Whitney signed the acquisition and assumption clauses in front of the independent notary. On Thursday evening, I sat alone at my kitchen island. The custom legal documents were printed and resting securely in my leather briefcase. The forensic cyber team was on standby, waiting for my father's inevitable data transfer attempt. The police were holding Connor and waiting for my signal to execute the warrants. Everything was perfectly aligned. I picked up my cell phone and turned it back on. The screen immediately lit up with dozens of missed calls and vicious text messages from my extended family. They were still demanding I apologize, still calling me crazy, still threatening me with total isolation. I ignored all of them. I opened the family group chat. The thread included my mother, my father Whitney, and several of my aunts and uncles. I took a breath. I needed to play the part of the broken, defeated daughter one last time. I needed them to believe their psychological warfare had worked perfectly. I typed the message with deliberate care, ensuring the tone conveyed absolute surrender. I don't want to fight anymore. I'll bring the signed gallery transfer papers to the charity dinner on Friday. You win. I finally hit the send button. I set my phone face down on the cold quartz countertop and walked away. The trap was set, and the wolves were waiting. Friday evening brought a biting wind sweeping off Lake Michigan, but the atmosphere outside the Oak Brook Country Club was entirely insulated from the chill. A line of valet attendants in crisp uniforms hurried to open the doors of idling luxury vehicles. The grand stone facade of the clubhouse was bathed in golden uplighting, casting long dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns. This was my mother's crowning social achievement of the season. The annual charity gala was an event designed exclusively to showcase our family's supposed generosity and impeccable social standing. But I knew the ugly truth hiding beneath the crystal chandeliers and the imported floral arrangements. This extravagant party was secretly being bankrolled by the venture capital firm Whitney was currently courting. She was using my stolen gallery property, the assets she thought she had successfully seized, as the primary collateral to secure her preliminary funding. They were drinking champagne and eating imported caviar on my dime. Usually for an event like this, I would wear a tailored designer gown, my hair perfectly styled, and my posture radiating absolute authority. Tonight, I had deliberately orchestrated a much different look. I wore a plain black dress that was slightly out of season and noticeably wrinkled at the hem. I had practiced stooping my shoulders, letting my head hang to project the image of a woman utterly crushed by the weight of her own failure. I clutched my battered leather briefcase to my chest. I needed them to look at me and see exactly what they expected to see: a defeated scapegoat crawling back to her masters to surrender. The heavy oak doors were pulled open for me, and I stepped into the sprawling grand ballroom. A string quartet played softly from a raised dais in the corner, while hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest elites mingled in their tuxedos and diamond necklaces. The room buzzed with the low hum of money and privilege. I walked slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward, allowing the chaotic noise of the party to wash over me. I felt the familiar weight of the legal documents sitting inside my briefcase. I barely made it 10 steps past the coat check before the trap was sprung. "Fiona, darling, you actually came." The voice sliced through the elegant noise of the ballroom like a polished blade. I stopped and looked up. My mother Joanne was gliding toward me through the crowd. She was flanked by two women I recognized as board members of the charity, both dripping in diamonds and watching me with poorly concealed pity. Harrison walked closely behind her, projecting the image of the stoic protective patriarch. He wore a custom tuxedo and held a crystal glass of scotch in one hand. "Oh, my sweet girl," my mother cooed, reaching out to place a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. She gripped me just hard enough to make it a warning rather than a caress. "We were so worried about you." She turned to the two board members, her face twisting into a mask of tragic maternal concern. "My eldest daughter has been under so much terrible strain lately. We have been trying to get her to step back and let the family help manage her affairs. The board members nodded sympathetically, murmuring their collective support. I forced myself to shrink back, pulling the briefcase tighter against my chest. I stared at the highly polished marble floor and let my voice waver slightly. "I am fine, Mother," I mumbled. "I just came to do what we agreed on." Harrison stepped forward, inserting his large frame between me and the other guests. He placed a heavy hand on my back, guiding me away from the lingering socialites. We walked toward a quiet alcove near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the dark golf course. As soon as we were out of earshot, his paternal facade instantly vanished. His face hardened into a mask of pure, smug victory. "I see you finally decided to use whatever small amount of sense you have left," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I told you that you could not win a war against this family. Your husband ran off, your business is locked down, and you are standing in a country club looking like a stray dog." I kept my head bowed and let my shoulders slump even further. I did not say a word. I just let him deliver his victory speech. I let him bask in the glory of my supposed destruction. My silence only seemed to fuel his arrogance. "Do you have the property transfer papers?" he demanded, gesturing sharply toward my leather briefcase. "Whitney is finalizing the venture capital introductions right now. We need the physical deed signed and notarized tonight. The investors are expecting to see the brick-and-mortar assets firmly under Whitney's control before they release the preliminary funds. I will not have you ruin this for her because of your childish stubbornness." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on his polished black shoes. "I brought them," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just want this to be over. I want my life back. I am tired of fighting." Joanne stepped into the alcove, joining us. She had dismissed her friends, and now her face mirrored my father's cold triumph. "Of course you are tired of fighting, Fiona," she said smoothly, taking a sip from her champagne flute. "You were never built for the real pressures of the business world. This is for your own good. Whitney has the vision and the connections to take that gallery and turn it into something truly spectacular. You are just handing over an asset you were bound to ruin anyway." She reached out and adjusted the collar of my wrinkled coat, her fingers brushing against my neck. It felt like a snake crawling across my skin. "You should go find a quiet corner and wait until Whitney is ready for you," Joanne instructed, her tone shifting to that of a master giving orders to a servant. "Do not mingle. Do not speak to any of the board members. You look far too unstable to be socializing, and I will not have you embarrassing the family name any further. We have worked entirely too hard to secure these venture capital relationships. Go sit down. We will come find you when it is time to sign the documents." I looked up at her, letting a flicker of forced panic show in my eyes. "The client files," I stammered, playing the part perfectly. "Connor took my primary drives. You promised that if I signed the gallery over to Whitney, you would not release those files to the press. You promised you would keep the blackmail material quiet." Harrison let out a short, dismissive laugh. He took a slow sip of his scotch, his gray eyes boring into mine. "Assuming you behave yourself tonight and sign the transfer deed exactly as instructed, we will bury the client data," he said. "You get to walk away with your reputation intact, and we get the gallery. It is a very generous offer, Fiona." "Okay," I said, clutching the briefcase. "I will wait for Whitney." Harrison gave me one last look of disdain. "Go ahead, Joanne," he said. "The senator just arrived, and you need to make sure he sees you near the auction tables. I will take Fiona to the private room." My mother took his arm. "Stay out of sight, Fiona," she commanded. I watched my mother turn on her heel, her heavy silk gown swishing against the marble floor as she seamlessly transitioned back into the role of the gracious hostess. She approached a group of donors with a radiant smile, her previous venom completely vanishing. My father did not leave my side. His hand remained firmly planted between my shoulder blades, a heavy, unyielding pressure that propelled me forward. We bypassed the crowded main floor, entirely slipping through a discreet set of arched double doors that led into the private corridors of the country club. The vibrant noise of the string quartet and the clinking champagne glasses instantly faded, replaced by the hushed, expensive silence of thick carpet and wood-paneled walls. The scent of aged leather and lemon polish hung in the air. I could hear the muffled laughter of the socialites echoing behind us, serving as a bitter reminder of exactly what was at stake tonight. They were completely oblivious to the vicious extortion happening right beneath their feet. I kept my chin tucked down, holding my battered briefcase tightly against my chest, playing the part of the thoroughly broken woman they believed they had successfully crushed. I dragged my feet deliberately, making each step look like an agonizing effort to push forward. My father did not say a word as he marched me down the long, dimly lit hallway. He treated me like a prisoner being led to the execution block. At the very end of the corridor stood a set of solid oak doors guarded by a club attendant who quickly stepped aside and pulled the heavy brass handles open for us. My father shoved me roughly into the room. It was a private VIP boardroom, a space designed for backroom deals and quiet intimidation. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather executive chairs. The lighting was low and moody, reflecting off a crystal decanter of bourbon sitting on a side table. Whitney was already there. She was lounging in the chair at the absolute head of the table, wearing a breathtakingly expensive emerald green evening gown that clung perfectly to her figure. Her blonde hair was swept up into an intricate style, and a diamond necklace glittered against her collarbone. She looked like a queen waiting for a peasant to bring her an offering. Standing directly behind her, resting a possessive hand on her bare shoulder, was her fiancé, Richard. Richard was a junior partner at a prominent Chicago investment bank, a man whose entire personality consisted of inherited wealth and unearned arrogance. He was exactly the kind of man my family worshipped. A man who measured a person's worth entirely by their net value and their proximity to power. He had spent the last 2 years treating me like an inconvenient obstacle, blocking his access to my family wealth. Tonight, he finally got to watch me fall. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket and a smug, predatory smirk that perfectly matched my sister's. They looked like a matched set of beautiful, soulless sharks. My father closed the heavy oak doors behind us, shutting out the rest of the world. The lock clicked into place with a heavy, final sound. Well, Whitney purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Look who finally decided to join the adults. I was beginning to wonder if you were going to cower out and hide in your apartment all night. I stood at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing a slight tremor into my hands as I gripped the handle of my briefcase. I did not want to come here, I said, keeping my voice low and brittle. I just want this nightmare to be over. Richard let out a short, condescending laugh. He picked up his crystal glass of bourbon and took a slow sip. It is over, Fiona, he said, looking at me as if I were a stain on the expensive carpet. You lost. Now do what you were told so we can all get back to the party. Put the briefcase on the table, Fiona, my father ordered, stepping up to stand beside Whitney. Do not make this any more difficult than it already is. We have investors waiting in the main ballroom who are very eager to meet the new owner of the gallery. I slowly lifted the heavy leather briefcase and set it on the polished mahogany surface. The brass latches clicked loudly in the quiet room as I opened it. I reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Marcus Sterling had so carefully prepared. The property transfer deed. The contract that looked like my total surrender, but was actually a legally binding financial death warrant. I slid the thick stack of paper across the smooth wood. Whitney snatched the documents eagerly, her manicured fingernails scraping against the table. She flipped past the cover page, her eyes scanning the standard boilerplate language that transferred the physical real estate and the operating licenses into her name. She did not bother to read the fine print. She did not look at the dense liability clauses buried in the fourth section. She was too blinded by her own greed, too intoxicated by the rush of stealing everything I had built. You really should be thanking me, Fiona, Whitney said, leaning back in her leather chair and tossing the documents back onto the table. I am doing you a massive favor tonight. I am taking this enormous burden off your hands. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, maintaining my posture of total defeat. A favor, I whispered, letting my voice crack slightly. Of course it is a favor, Whitney replied, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. You were drowning, Fiona. Everyone in the family could see it. You were running that gallery straight into the ground with your cautious, outdated business model. You had no vision. You had no strategy for aggressive expansion. You were just maintaining a sinking ship and embarrassing the family name in the process. I am stepping in to save our reputation before you drag us all down with you. Richard chuckled, running his hand down Whitney's bare arm. She is right, Fiona, he sneered. The art world is moving fast. It requires capital, aggressive networking, and a willingness to take risks. You are just a glorified shopkeeper. Whitney actually knows how to leverage assets. The venture capital firm we are meeting with tonight is going to pump $10 million into the new expansion solely based on Whitney's strategic vision. You are holding the property back. I stared at Richard, feeling a cold, sharp thrill ignite in the center of my chest. They were going to use my stolen gallery to secure a $10 million venture capital loan. The very gallery that was about to be legally tied to Connor's $3 million of toxic debt. The resulting explosion was going to be magnificent, but I forced my face to remain pale and frightened. You stole my entire life, I said, letting a single carefully orchestrated tear slip down my cheek. You literally blackmailed me with my own private client files. Whitney rolled her perfectly lined eyes and let out an exasperated, dramatic sigh. Oh, stop being so melodramatic, Fiona. It is honestly pathetic. Honestly, it is absolutely no wonder Connor finally got sick of you and walked out. The cruelty of her words hung in the stale air of the VIP room. I let the insult hit me, sinking my teeth into the inside of my cheek to keep my expression carefully arranged in a mask of total devastation. A real tear would be difficult to conjure again, so I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a ragged, broken breath. I lowered my head, allowing my hair to fall forward and obscure my face. I needed them to feel the absolute high of their cruelty. I needed them to believe they had stripped away my last ounce of dignity. I reached across the table and picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I kept my eyes on the floor, making sure my fingers visibly shook as they brushed against the cold metal. It was a flawless performance, and they were the perfect captive audience. My father let out a heavy sigh of extreme impatience, crossing his arms over his chest. Just sign the damn papers, Fiona, he barked, tapping a thick, blunt finger against the bottom of the top page. We have wasted enough time indulging your pathetic attempts at resistance. Sign on the dotted line and we can all move on with our lives. You will feel much better once this is over, and you are no longer pretending to be a businesswoman. I pulled the stack of legal documents a few inches closer to me. I stared down at the crisp black ink detailing the transfer. My eyes flicked briefly over the fourth section where Marcus had buried the lethal assumption of debt clause. It was camouflaged flawlessly beneath layers of mundane corporate transfer jargon. Anyone reading it quickly would assume it was standard legal protection. But it was a financial grenade wrapped in a velvet ribbon. I unspooled the cap of the heavy gold pen and set it carefully beside the documents. My eyes moved across the cover page one final time. In bold letters, it identified the transaction as the transfer of Fiona Vance's gallery operations. To anyone eager to see what they wanted to see, it looked like the surrender of my downtown property and the business attached to it. Buried in the legal schedules, however, the entity being transferred was the abandoned Legacy Holding Company. The real building authentic inventory, international licenses, and genuine client files belonged to an entirely separate corporation. I placed the nib against the first signature line. My hand trembled just enough to preserve the performance. I signed as the transferring member of the Legacy Company, flipped to the next marked page, and signed the authorization allowing Whitney to assume control if she formally accepted the acquisition. Whitney watched every stroke with open hunger. You are finally doing something useful for this family, she said. Once I take control, the investors will see what competent leadership can accomplish. My father pulled the pages toward himself before the ink had fully dried. He checked each tab Marcus had placed beside my signature lines, then frowned when he reached the final section. There are acceptance signatures here, he said. Of course there are, I whispered. The acquiring owner has to acknowledge the transfer before it becomes effective. Whitney extended her hand. Give them to me. Before my father could pass her the documents, a quiet knock sounded at the oak door. Harrison glanced toward it with irritation. "Who is that?" The door opened, and a woman in a conservative navy suit stepped inside carrying a narrow leather case. She appeared to be in her late 50s, calm and professionally detached. "Evelyn Shaw," she said. "I am the licensed mobile notary requested for the commercial closing in this room. The country club directed me here." My father relaxed immediately. He assumed one of his assistants had arranged her presence. He gestured impatiently toward the table. "Perfect. We need this completed immediately." Evelyn placed her identification commission certificate and embossed seal on the table. She did not look at me with recognition. Marcus had chosen her because she understood exactly how to remain neutral. "I need to verify the identity of every signing party," she said. "I will also ask each person whether they are signing voluntarily and whether they have had an opportunity to review the document." Whitney rolled her eyes. "This is a routine family transfer. We do not need a lecture." "It will take less than 2 minutes," Evelyn replied. I handed over my driver's license. Whitney produced hers from a jeweled clutch. Evelyn recorded the details, then turned to me first. "Ms. Vance, are you signing these documents voluntarily?" I looked briefly at my father. His expression carried the same threat he had delivered over the phone, but I kept my voice quiet. "I am signing the transfer documents presented tonight." Evelyn studied me for a beat, then noted my answer without interpretation. She turned toward Whitney. "Ms. Wilson, the documents identify you as the acquiring party and incoming controlling member of the transferred entity. Have you had an opportunity to review them?" Whitney glanced at the stack for less than a second. "Yes," she said dismissively. "Do you understand that your acceptance includes the assets, accounts, digital systems, contractual obligations and liabilities listed in the attached schedules?" My father's jaw tightened. "Just answer her, Whitney." Whitney picked up the gold pen. "Yes, I understand. I am accepting all of it." The room seemed to become perfectly still. Evelyn pointed to the first tab. "Sign here as the acquiring member. The second signature confirms immediate operational control. The third acknowledges the assumption of the obligations listed in the schedules." Whitney did not read a single line. She signed the first page with an extravagant flourish, turned the stack, and signed the second. When she reached the liability acknowledgement, Richard leaned over her shoulder. "It is standard acquisition language," he said. "Every deal has it." Whitney smiled and signed the third line. The final stroke of her pen was the sound of the trap closing. Evelyn rotated the documents toward my father. "Mr. Wilson, you are identified as the transaction sponsor and guarantor of the acquiring company's performance. Your signature confirms that you presented the transaction and witnessed Ms. Wilson's acceptance." Harrison barely glanced at the page. He signed with a thick, aggressive slash, then shoved the pen away. "There. It is finished." Evelyn applied her stamp to each required page. The crisp impact of the seal echoed through the private room. She wrote the time, closed her journal, and placed a certified copy in a plain envelope. "The transaction is notarized," she said. "Each party will receive a copy after the original is filed." My father gathered the papers against his chest with an expression of absolute triumph. He had wanted a public surrender he could show the investors. Instead, he was holding a documented chain connecting himself and Whitney to the legacy company, its compromised server, and every obligation Connor had hidden inside it. "Good girl," Harrison said to me. "Now go home before you embarrass us any further." Whitney reached for a neon yellow sticky note and wrote a sequence of letters and numbers across it. She slid it over the polished table. "These are the new master credentials for the legacy mainframe," she said. "I changed them myself after Connor gave us access. You can retrieve any personal files you left behind, but do not touch the client folders. They belong to me now, and I am moving everything to my private server this weekend." Her admission was even cleaner than I had hoped. She had just confirmed in front of a notary and 2 witnesses that she had personally taken administrative control of the stolen system. I picked up the sticky note and folded it once. "And the files my father threatened to release?" I asked. Whitney leaned back in her chair. "Signatures first, mercy second. As long as you stay quiet and stop challenging the acquisition, the data stays private. 'Cause another problem, and Dad sends everything to the press. Evelyn's pen paused briefly above her journal before continuing to write. Richard smiled at me. You heard her. The adults have the business now. I lowered my eyes, allowing them one final view of the broken woman they believed they had created. Thank you for clarifying the terms, I whispered. I closed my empty briefcase and turned toward the oak doors. Behind me, Whitney was already photographing the notarized cover page to send to the investors waiting in the ballroom. My father poured himself another bourbon. Richard congratulated her on becoming the new owner. None of them opened the schedules. None of them noticed Evelyn quietly seal her notes inside the leather case. And none of them understood that in less than an hour, Whitney would stand beneath the ballroom lights and publicly boast about controlling the same entity she had just accepted in writing. I turned around, gripping my battered leather briefcase with both hands. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, feeling my father's cold, dismissive gaze burning into my back. Richard stepped forward and pulled the heavy brass handle open for me, a mocking smile plastered across his handsome face. Safe travels home, Fiona, he sneered. Do not trip on your way out. I walked through the doorway, leaving the private VIP room behind me. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing me from their toxic presence. The moment the latch engaged, my entire physical demeanor instantly changed. I dropped the slumped, defeated posture. I pulled my shoulders back and lifted my chin. The deliberate trembling in my hands completely vanished, replaced by a cold, steady stillness. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the lemon-scented air. The oppressive, suffocating weight of my family's expectations was officially gone. I had given them exactly what they demanded, and in return, they had eagerly swallowed a fatal dose of financial poison. I walked down the hushed, carpeted corridor toward the main ballroom. I did not walk out the grand front doors to the valet stand. I had no intention of going home to rest. My father had told me to leave, but I was not about to miss the main event. I navigated through the outer hallway and slipped through a side entrance that led to the upper balcony of the country club. It was a secluded viewing area offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the sprawling grand ballroom below. I stepped up to the ornate brass railing and looked down at the sea of wealthy guests mingling under the crystal chandeliers. I set my briefcase on a cocktail table and smoothed my coat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the yellow sticky note. The trap was locked. Now I just needed to wait for the exact moment it snapped shut. I stood in the shadows of the upper balcony, letting the ambient noise wash over me. Down below, catering staff cleared appetizer plates and poured fresh champagne. The subtle shift in energy signaled the transition to the main presentation. An event coordinator stepped onto the dais and tapped the microphone. Sharp feedback echoed, cutting through the chatter. The crowd of wealthy investors and politicians turned their immediate attention toward the front of the crowded room. It was finally my cue to move. I made my way down the carpeted staircase and slipped into the main ballroom through side doors, keeping my back very close to the draped walls. The stark contrast between my wrinkled dress and the glittering gowns was obvious, but nobody paid me mind. In a room entirely obsessed with status, a defeated ghost was practically invisible. Up near the front, my parents were holding court at the primary VIP table, looking like royalty preparing to crown their new heir. The event coordinator offered a glowing introduction praising the Wilson family business excellence before calling my sister to the stage. The applause was enthusiastic as Whitney glided up the carpeted steps. The emerald green fabric of her gown caught the stage spotlights, making her look exceptionally radiant and powerful. She stepped up to the clear acrylic podium and adjusted the slender microphone with a practiced smile. Richard stood at the edge of the stage, leading the loud applause. Whitney waited patiently for the room to fall completely silent before she began to speak. "Thank you all so very much for being here tonight," Whitney said, letting her gaze sweep across the expectant faces. "We are gathered to support a wonderful charitable cause, but tonight also marks a pivotal moment for the future of our family enterprise. As many of you know, the Sterling name has always stood for bold innovation, aggressive growth, and uncompromising excellence. We do not just build simple businesses, We build lasting legacies. The key investors seated around my parents nodded in eager agreement, completely captivated by her flawless presentation. For the past several years, I have been looking for the perfect flagship property to launch my new lifestyle and technology venture. Whitney continued, her voice echoing through the massive suspended speakers. I needed a cornerstone asset with strong physical real estate and a robust proprietary digital infrastructure. Unfortunately, I watched a prime property in our downtown arts district languish under poor management. It lacked long-term vision and the necessary drive to compete in today's rapidly evolving market. She let out a soft, practiced sigh. But I am absolutely thrilled to announce to our prospective partners tonight that I have officially acquired that very exact property. The room erupted into a fresh round of polite, enthusiastic applause. I briefly stopped walking, feeling a hot spark of pure adrenaline ignite in my veins as I listened to her gloat. She was standing in front of Chicago's most ruthless financial players, blatantly bragging about stealing my entire life. I have taken on the absolute burden of restructuring this business, Whitney said, her tone thick with arrogant authority. We are going to strictly strip away the absolute dead weight and completely transform it into a premier digital networking hub, using the initial round of venture funding we secure here tonight. I tore my eyes away from her illuminated face and focused intently on my final destination. In the far back corner of the grand ballroom, elevated slightly above the massive crowd, was the audio-visual control booth. It was cordoned off by heavy black velvet ropes, housing a complex array of mixing boards, glowing computer monitors, and thick cables. A young technician wearing a black polo shirt and a heavy headset was sitting behind the main lighting console, staring intently at a glowing laptop screen monitoring levels. I stepped right over the velvet rope and walked directly into his private workspace. He jumped slightly, visibly startled by my sudden unexpected appearance in the restricted area. He pulled one padded side of his headset off his ear and looked at me with profound confusion and annoyance. "Excuse me, ma'am," he whispered urgently, glancing nervously toward the brightly lit stage. "You are not supposed to be back here. This is a highly restricted production area only." I did not shrink back or offer any kind of apology. I drew upon absolutely every ounce of the cold, commanding authority I had spent years cultivating while running my downtown gallery. I stood straight up, making direct, unblinking eye contact with the young man. "I need you to push an updated presentation slide to the main projector system immediately," I said, keeping my voice low, firm, and completely devoid of any panic. I pulled out a sleek silver flash drive, holding it out steadily toward his chest. The technician frowned deeply, looking skeptically at the silver flash drive and then down at my wrinkled out-of-season dress. "I do not know about that." He hesitated, shifting very uncomfortably. "The primary event coordinator gave me a very strict run of show schedule to follow. Nobody said anything to me about adding new slides in the middle of the keynote presentation. I am only supposed to put up the corporate logo when she finally finishes speaking." I stepped much closer to the heavy console, invading his personal space just enough to make him feel the intense weight of my presence. "My name is Fiona Vance," I said, enunciating each syllable with icy, terrifying precision. "That woman currently speaking on the stage is my sister. The people sitting in the front row paying your production company tonight are my parents. My sister just finalized a massive acquisition deal right backstage and explicitly requested that this specific data be displayed behind her while she concludes her investor pitch." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from my face to the stage and back again. The mention of my family name and the absolute confidence in my voice clearly rattled him. He was just a hired contractor and did not want to risk angering the wealthy family writing his paycheck. "Are you going to be the one who ruins her presentation by refusing to display her financial data?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Or are you going to plug this in right now?" He let out a nervous breath and took the flash drive from my hand. "Fine," he muttered, plugging the small device into his primary laptop. I watched the screen as a folder popped up reading simply, "Assumed liabilities." The technician clicked on the single high-resolution image file, loading it into his preview window. "What is this?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he looked at the dense columns of numbers and legal warning text. That is the absolutely undeniable reality of her brand new business venture, I said, stepping back toward the heavy velvet rope. Just leave it on standby for now. When I give you the specific signal, you will override the background logo and push that image to the massive projector screens flanking the stage. He nodded very hesitantly, his hand hovering over the mouse pad. I slipped out of the production booth and faded back into the dark perimeter of the ballroom, finding a quiet, secure spot near a towering marble pillar. Whitney was wrapping up her lengthy monologue, grinning down at the venture capitalists, completely unaware of the loaded gun currently pointed directly at her back. The asset we are acquiring tonight is not just a building, Whitney projected, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It is a carefully curated ecosystem of the most elite collectors and buyers in the Midwest. We are inheriting a proprietary client database that has taken a decade to build. These are individuals with high net worths who trust the foundation of this gallery. By migrating this established roster into our new digital platform, we are guaranteeing our investors an immediate return. We are bypassing the traditional startup phase entirely. We already have the clients. We already have the capital. All we needed was the proper leadership to take the helm. She smiled broadly, showing off her perfectly white teeth. To visually represent this transition, I want to show you the new face of our enterprise, the brand that will redefine the luxury art market in Chicago. She gestured grandly toward the massive dual projection screens hanging on either side of the stage. A low hum resonated through the ballroom as the projectors powered up. Whitney turned her body, slightly anticipating the grand reveal of her sleek, modern corporate logo. Instead, the massive screens flashed a brilliant, blinding white before dropping into the grainy, high-definition black and white of a security camera feed. The timestamp in the corner glowed brightly, indicating a date from just over a week ago. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd of men in tuxedos and women in designer gowns. People adjusted their glasses and leaned forward, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in production value. Whitney frowned lightly, tapping the edge of her acrylic podium. She looked toward the back of the room, expecting to see the technicians scrambling to fix a simple rendering error. But the video continued to play. The scene on the twin screens depicted the dimly lit underground parking garage of my gallery. The frame was perfectly still until a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Connor, wearing the same dark hoodie he had worn when he breached my server room. He was clutching a thick, padded envelope against his chest. A moment later, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled into the frame. The driver's side door opened, and my father stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light of the parking garage. The audio feed crackled to life, echoing through the massive ballroom speakers. It was crisp and undeniable. Connor held out the padded envelope. "The drive is in there," Connor said, his voice vibrating through the elegant space. "Every single client file, every portfolio, every financial record. It is all decrypted just like you asked. Now call off the debt collectors, Harrison. We had a deal." On the massive screens, my father took the envelope and smiled, that same cold, predatory smile he had given me just an hour ago. "You will get your money when the data is verified, Connor," my father replied, his voice booming across the country club ballroom. "Just keep playing the supportive husband until Whitney secures the property. Once Fiona is broken, the gallery is ours and your gambling debts vanish." The ballroom was plunging into a state of collective shock. The clinking of champagne flutes completely ceased. The soft classical music from the string quartet had faded away moments ago, leaving nothing but the damning echo of my father's voice filling the cavernous space. The venture capitalists sitting in the front row, the very men Whitney was relying on to fund her stolen empire, lowered their drinks. They stared up at the screens with expressions of mounting horror and professional disgust. Corporate espionage was a serious crime. Admitting to it on camera was professional suicide. Whitney stood frozen at the podium. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue. Her mouth hung slightly open as she stared at the 50-foot projection of our father bribing my husband to destroy my life. She gripped the edges of the acrylic stand so hard, her knuckles turned stark white. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice coming out as a breathless, panicked squeak. "Cut the feed," she demanded. "Turn that off right now." But the technician in the back booth had been given a direct order, and the sequence was already locked in. The video feed dissolved into black. For a fleeting second, Whitney let out a ragged sigh of relief. Then the next slide loaded. It was a high-resolution scan of the heavy cream-colored cardstock Joanne had left beneath the ribbon on my doorstep. My mother's elegant, looping handwriting was blown up to massive proportions, easily readable by every single person in the room. The words hung there suspended in the dark space for everyone to witness. "Sign the transfer deed to Whitney, or we release the client data to the press and ruin you. We own the files, Fiona. Do not test us." A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of attendees. Whispers broke out, spreading like wildfire through the ranks of Chicago's elite. People were turning their heads, searching the crowd for my parents. I remained perfectly still near the marble pillar, watching the destruction unfold, with a cold, hollow satisfaction. I saw my mother standing near the center of the room. Joanne was clutching her throat, her diamond rings glittering as her hands shook violently. She looked frantically toward my father, who was standing completely paralyzed, his jaw slack as he stared up at his own undeniable crime projected for the entire city to see. The mask of the generous philanthropic patriarch had been violently ripped away, leaving only the ugly reality of a common extortionist. The nightmare was not over. The presentation software ticked forward, ruthlessly executing the final phase of the trap. The handwritten blackmail note vanished, replaced by a meticulously organized spreadsheet. It was the financial diagnostic Caldwell had shown me at the police precinct. The screen displayed a long list of wire transfers. The originating accounts were clearly labeled with the names of Harrison's primary holding companies. The receiving accounts belonged to the offshore shell corporations Connor used to hide his massive gambling debts. The dates aligned perfectly with every major financial loss my gallery had suffered over the past 8 months. The amounts were staggering. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. A clear, undeniable paper trail proving that my father had actively financed the slow, methodical destruction of my marriage and my business. He had paid for the corporate sabotage out of his own pocket. The sheer scale of the betrayal was laid bare in indisputable black and white. There was no spinning this. There was no PR firm powerful enough to draft a press release that could explain away security footage, handwritten extortion, and matching bank records. They were caught. The ballroom fell into a stunned, deafening silence. It was the kind of absolute quiet that only happens when a room full of powerful people witnesses a total catastrophic ruin. Absolutely no one moved. No one spoke. The wealthy investors in the front row, the men and women who had been ready to hand Whitney $10 million just moments ago, were now looking at her with open revulsion. They were silently calculating how fast they could distance themselves from the Wilson family name. They were all watching a criminal conspiracy unspool in real time. Whitney remained frozen at the podium, completely exposed under the bright, hot stage lights. The spell of stunned silence shattered when my father finally snapped out of his paralysis. His face turned a deep, mottled purple, and the thick veins in his neck bulged visibly against his starched white collar. He let out a raw, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage that startled the wealthy investors sitting at his table. He shoved his heavy banquet chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. Harrison charged toward the front of the room, completely ignoring the shocked gasps and panicked murmurs of his peers. He bypassed the stage entirely and locked his furious gaze on the audio-visual booth in the back. "Cut that feed," he screamed, pointing a thick, shaking finger at the young technician. "I said, cut the damn feed right now, or I will personally destroy your entire production company and ensure you never work in this city again." The young technician scrambled backward in his rolling chair, absolutely terrified by the massive, angry man storming toward him. He slammed his hand onto the main console, ripping the primary power cord straight out of the socket. The twin projection screens went entirely black, plunging the stage backdrop into deep shadow. But the damage was already permanently done. The damning images and audio were seared into the minds of every powerful broker and venture capitalist in the room. The low rumble of voices began to rise into a chaotic clamor of outrage and confusion. Investors were already pulling out their smartphones, texting their legal teams, and advising their associates to pull all funding. I stepped out from behind the towering marble pillar and walked slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom. A secondary microphone stand had been set up near the front row intended for investor questions after the main keynote address. I reached the stand and wrapped my fingers firmly around the slender metal neck. I tapped the rounded top of the microphone twice. The sharp rhythmic thumping echoed through the massive suspended speakers, instantly cutting through the rising panic of the crowd. The grand ballroom quieted down as hundreds of heads turned in my direction. I looked up at the stage where my sister was still gripping the clear acrylic podium, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. Then I looked over at my father, who had stopped dead in his tracks halfway down the side aisle. He stared at me with a look of absolute murderous hatred. "You cannot turn off the truth, Dad," I said, my voice ringing out cold and commanding across the cavernous room. "The documents have already been filed and the evidence is already in the hands of the authorities. You wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate acquisition, but you forgot to actually verify what you were buying." Whitney found her voice, her hands shaking so badly the podium rattled against the floorboards. "You signed the transfer deeds, Fiona?" she stammered, leaning into her own microphone. "We own the gallery. We own your entire client list. You signed everything away in the VIP room not an hour ago. We have the notarized paperwork in our possession right now." I shook my head slowly, letting a calm, terrifying smile spread across my face. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes, taking in the absolute terror radiating from her rigid posture. "I did not sign over a thriving business tonight, Whitney," I stated clearly, ensuring every single investor in the room caught every single word. "I signed over an empty shell corporation." My mother let out a sharp gasp from her seat in the front row, dropping her beaded clutch onto the carpet. But I kept my focus locked entirely on my sister. "The paperwork you were so incredibly eager to snatch out of my hands transferred the ownership of a dummy corporation I set up specifically for this exact occasion." I explained, my voice steady and unyielding. "It holds absolutely zero client data. It holds zero physical art assets. It holds zero intellectual property. What it does hold, however, is a massive amount of highly toxic debt." My father took a heavy, threatening step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "What did you do, you ungrateful little brat?" he barked, his voice carrying without the need for any amplification. "I gave you exactly what you demanded," I replied, my tone remaining perfectly level despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "You wanted me to sign the assumption of liability clause that your expensive lawyers buried on the fourth page of the contract. You thought you were cleverly inheriting my operational debts while seizing my pristine assets. But you were actually claiming legal responsibility for the offshore accounts Connor used to hide his devastating gambling losses. I transferred those specific liabilities directly into that dummy corporation yesterday afternoon. By eagerly signing your master document tonight, Whitney officially and legally assumed $1.5 million in toxic high-interest debt. And that debt is owed to some very dangerous, uncompromising creditors who are currently looking for immediate repayment." The blood drained completely from Whitney's face, leaving her looking pale and sickly under the stage lights. She stumbled backward away from the podium as if the acrylic stand itself had suddenly caught fire. She looked frantically down at Richard, who was staring up at her with wide, terrified eyes. He slowly took a deliberate step back, physically distancing himself from the sinking ship. $1.5 million, she whispered, her voice cracking over the microphone, as the reality of her financial ruin settled over her. "You anchored Connor's debt to my name." I nodded, watching the realization crush her perfectly crafted, arrogant exterior. "You demanded the keys to the kingdom, Whitney. Now you get to deal with the hungry wolves waiting at the gate. You wanted to be a ruthless businesswoman so badly, but you failed to do basic due diligence on the very asset you were stealing." My father was breathing heavily, his face now pale and drawn. The investors around him were already standing up, retrieving their coats, and signaling to their spouses that it was time to leave immediately. The Wilson family name, which had once commanded such immense respect and fear in this city, was now officially radioactive. No one in this room would ever do business with them again. They were ruined. But the gallery, my father stammered, his voice losing all its booming authority and reducing to a desperate wheeze. The real assets. Where are they? I smoothed the front of my wrinkled coat, feeling liberation wash over my entire soul. The heavy chains they had wrapped around me for my entire life were broken. The real assets are entirely secure, I announced, projecting my voice to the back of the room. The actual multi-million-dollar holding company that controls my physical gallery space, my authentic client roster, and my international brokerage rights was never on the table. While you were busy bribing my husband and setting up a pathetic extortion ring, I was negotiating with a legitimate global partner. I finalized a massive international merger this very morning. The capital has cleared, the new corporate structure is fully operational, and the ink is completely dry. You spent months plotting to destroy me just to steal an empty box and ruin yourselves in the process. My father let out a raw, guttural sound that was much less human and far more like a desperately wounded animal. The polished veneer of the sophisticated gentleman shattered, exposing the violent, controlling tyrant underneath. He immediately lunged forward, his heavy, frantic footsteps thudding loudly against the thick carpeted aisle of the grand ballroom. He ignored the shocked gasps of the wealthy investors watching their lavish evening implode. He only saw red. He was coming straight for me, his hands outstretched, his face twisted in unfiltered rage. He was going to try and silence me by sheer physical force and intimidation. I did not move an inch. I stood my ground, gripping the cold metal of the microphone stand. I wanted him to see I was no longer the frightened little girl who craved his approval. I was the architect of his absolute downfall. He was less than 10 feet away when a sudden deafening crash echoed from the rear of the grand ballroom. The massive carved oak doors were thrown open with violent force, slamming against the interior walls. A cold gust of night air swept into the stifling room, carrying the piercing sound of police sirens wailing in the distance. A highly coordinated team of uniformed police officers spilled into the elegant space, their heavy black boots sharply contrasting with the delicate crystal and silk surrounding them. Leading the rigid formation was Detective Caldwell. Caldwell wore his rumpled trench coat, but his posture was rigid and authoritative. He held his gold shield high, his sharp, observant eyes instantly scanning the room until they locked onto my father. The crowd of elite socialites and powerful venture capitalists parted like the Red Sea, scrambling to get out of the way of the advancing officers. Nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire of a public arrest. They pressed themselves against the linen-draped banquet tables, watching the spectacle unfold with morbid fascination. My father stopped dead in his tracks, his forward momentum broken by the sudden arrival of local law enforcement. He turned his massive frame toward the center aisle, his chest heaving as he watched Caldwell approach. The angry crimson color rapidly drained from my father's face, replaced by a sickly pale hue. "Detective," my father stammered, his voice shaking. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding here. This is a private corporate event, and my daughter is clearly suffering from a severe mental breakdown. We are handling this internally. Please escort your men out immediately." Caldwell did not even slow his deliberate pace. He marched right up to my father, stopping just inches away from his chest, forcing the larger man to look down. "There is no misunderstanding, Harrison," the detective said, his voice carrying a harsh, unyielding authority. "We have secured the security footage from the underground parking garage. We have confiscated the offshore bank records tracking your illicit wire transfers. We have the handwritten extortion note your wife used to threaten your own daughter. You are not handling anything internally ever again. Your reign in the city is officially over." Two uniformed officers stepped smoothly around Caldwell and grabbed my father's arms, pulling them behind his back. My father tried to yank his arms away, his rising panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "You cannot do this!" he shouted, his voice cracking as he looked wildly at the surrounding investors, hoping someone would intervene. "I am Harrison Wilson. I own half the commercial real estate in this downtown district. I will ruin your entire department. Caldwell simply pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt. You are Harrison Wilson. The detective agreed, his tone devoid of any sympathy. And you are under arrest for grand larceny, corporate extortion, and blackmail. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you start using it immediately before you incriminate yourself any further. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around my father's wrists sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He slumped forward, the fight completely draining out of his massive frame. He was going straight to a federal holding cell. The officers turned him around and began marching him down the long center aisle, leading the fallen patriarch out of the country club in absolute total disgrace. Caldwell turned his attention directly to the brightly lit stage. Whitney was standing behind the clear acrylic podium, clutching the edges as if it were a life raft. She was trembling so violently that the microphone picked up the rattling of her expensive diamond jewelry. Tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her flawless makeup. She looked down at Caldwell with wide, terrified eyes, shaking her head in frantic, panicked denial. I had nothing to do with that, she cried out, her voice echoing shrilly through the massive speakers. I did not know he paid Connor to steal those digital files. I am just trying to launch my new lifestyle business. You have to believe me, I am a victim here too. She looked desperately toward Richard, who was standing near the edge of the stage. Richard, she pleaded, reaching a trembling, manicured hand out toward him. Tell them I had absolutely no idea about the blackmail. Richard looked at my sister, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, unapologetic self-preservation. He slowly took another deliberate step backward, holding his hands up defensively. Do not bring me into this, Whitney, he muttered, his voice low and cowardly. I just handle the public relations marketing. I do not know anything about your illegal family business. He turned on his heel and quickly slipped behind the heavy velvet stage curtains, abandoning her to her fate. Whitney let out a broken, ragged sob, watching her golden ticket vanish. Caldwell stepped up to the edge of the carpeted stage, looking up at her with cold, professional detachment. Whitney Wilson, he said, his voice cutting sharply through her frantic, rambling apologies. Less than an hour ago, you willingly signed a stack of legally binding transfer documents in the private VIP room down the hall. By eagerly signing those transfer deeds and accepting the associated liabilities, you officially linked yourself directly to a massive corporate espionage ring. You took total legal ownership of the stolen property. You formally accepted the massive toxic debt used to finance the initial theft. You are now the sole documented administrator of a criminal enterprise. Whitney let out a sharp, terrified gasp, taking a staggering step backward. No, she breathed, shaking her head violently, sending her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. That cannot be right. I did not steal anything. I just signed the papers. My father forced me to do it. It is his fault. Two female officers climbed the carpeted stairs to the stage, approaching my sister. Whitney tried to back away from them, her high heels catching awkwardly on the stage carpeting. She stumbled backward and fell hard onto her knees, her emerald green gown tangling messily around her legs. She knelt there, weeping uncontrollably, as the officers pulled her arms behind her back. You are now under arrest for felony corporate espionage, Caldwell announced as the officers secured the cold metal handcuffs. Whitney sobbed hysterically, her public image completely and permanently shattered. I stood silently near the marble pillar, taking a deep, cleansing breath. I had survived their devastating fire, and I had successfully burned their entire corrupt world to the absolute ground forever. The handcuffs clicking shut broke the spell holding my mother. Joanne tore through the crowd of stunned investors, knocking over champagne flutes. Her face was a canvas of smeared mascara and panic. She lunged at me, her fingernails digging painfully into my forearm. Her grip was fueled by absolute desperation. How could you do this? She shrieked, pulling my arm. To your sister. To your father. We are your family, Fiona. You are destroying us. I stood perfectly still. I met her frantic, tear-filled eyes. There was no sympathy left. I deliberately pried her fingers off my arm. You stopped being my family the second you blackmailed me, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper that only she could hear. You handed me that note and threatened to destroy my entire life without a single ounce of hesitation. You made your choice, Joanne. Now try not to make a scene while they read her rights." My mother gasped, stumbling backward as if I had struck her. She clutched her chest, watching in absolute horror as Detective Caldwell read Whitney her Miranda rights right there on the stage. The grand ballroom dissolved into absolute chaos. Guests were holding up their smartphones, recording the spectacular downfall of the Wilson Empire. My father was already being frog-marched out the side exit, his head bowed to hide his face from the flashing cameras. Whitney followed shortly after, her emerald gown dragging along the floor, as two female officers escorted her down the stairs and out into the waiting police cruisers. I turned my back and walked out of the ballroom. I moved through the opulent lobby of the country club and pushed through the heavy brass front doors. The cool night air hit my face, feeling cleaner and fresher than it had in months. For the first time in my entire life, the suffocating weight of my family's expectations was entirely gone. I walked down the sweeping driveway, leaving the flashing red and blue police lights far behind me. 6 months passed, bringing a bright spring to the city of Chicago. The massive fallout from that night at the country club had dominated the local news cycle for weeks, but I had completely insulated myself from the media circus. I sat at the polished oak desk in my private office at the gallery, sipping a hot cup of black coffee. Sunlight streamed through the large floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the vibrant new artwork hanging on the freshly painted walls. My legitimate international merger had been a massive success, completely securing the financial future of my business. The gallery was thriving, expanding into European markets, and attracting a caliber of clientele my father could only have dreamed of. I opened my laptop and clicked on an email from my lead attorney. Attached was the finalized decree of my divorce. It was the absolute last piece of paperwork needed to completely sever my ties to the past. The process had been swift and utterly ruthless. Connor had tried to fight the proceedings, initially holding on to the delusion that he could still somehow manipulate his way into a lucrative settlement. He had hired a defense attorney and attempted to claim a portion of the gallery's newly acquired capital, arguing that he was entitled to spousal support. He had severely underestimated my preparation. My legal team immediately activated the ironclad infidelity and criminal conduct clauses I had secretly embedded in our marital agreements years ago. The financial records provided by Detective Caldwell, proving Connor's involvement in the corporate sabotage and extortion ring, were the final nails in his coffin. The judge presiding over our divorce case was thoroughly disgusted by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. The ruling was completely merciless. Connor was stripped of everything. He was denied any claim to my assets, my business, or my personal accounts. He walked out of family court absolutely penniless, his offshore gambling accounts frozen and seized by federal investigators. But the divorce was only the beginning of his nightmare. The criminal charges, carrying the weight of federal grand larceny and conspiracy to commit extortion, moved through the justice system with terrifying speed. Without my father's money or influence to shield him, Connor was left entirely exposed to the full wrath of the law. His trial had concluded just 3 weeks ago. I did not attend the sentencing hearing, but I read the transcripts provided by my legal team. Connor had stood before the judge looking thin and exhausted, begging for leniency and blaming his massive gambling addiction for his actions. He claimed my father had coerced him into stealing the digital drives. The judge did not care. The evidence of his willing participation and his greedy demands for debt forgiveness in the parking garage footage left absolutely no room for sympathy. Connor was handed a lengthy prison sentence. He traded his expensive tailored suits and luxury watches for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a concrete cell. He would spend the next decade locked away with nothing but his own choices to keep him company. The crushing reality that he had traded a beautiful, comfortable life for a cold prison cell, solely to feed his destructive habits, was a burden he would have to carry every single day. I closed the email attachment and leaned back in my leather chair. The divorce decree did not feel like a victory celebration. It felt like the final lock turning on a door I would never have to open again. Connor had lost every claim to my business and personal assets, and his criminal sentence meant he would spend years confronting the consequences he had tried to hide from me. I did not feel joy at the image of him in a prison cell. I felt distance. He had become a chapter whose ending no longer required my attention. The rest of the conspiracy had collapsed just as completely. Whitney initially insisted that she had been an innocent recipient of a family business transfer. That story lasted until prosecutors placed her text messages server activity and notarized acceptance documents in front of her attorneys. The message threatening to wipe the mainframe carried her device signature. The administrative logs showed that she had changed the passwords herself. Evelyn Shaw's journal recorded Whitney stating that she understood she was accepting the legacy company's systems and liabilities. Most damaging of all, the gala footage captured her publicly boasting that she controlled the stolen client database. Faced with evidence she could not explain away, Whitney accepted a plea agreement. She avoided the longest possible sentence, but she still received years in federal custody for conspiracy, attempted extortion, and possession of stolen corporate information. Richard Sterling ended their engagement before the first court hearing. His attorneys issued a cold statement claiming he had been unaware of her conduct. He disappeared from her life with the same efficiency he had once used to attach himself to her supposed success. My father fought much longer. Harrison hired a rotating team of expensive defense lawyers and demanded that every charge be dismissed as a private misunderstanding. The parking garage recording destroyed that defense. His own voice could be heard promising to erase Connor's gambling debt after the client data was delivered. The wire transfers connected his holding companies to Connor's offshore accounts. My mother's handwritten threat completed the chain. Harrison was convicted of conspiracy, corporate theft, and extortion. Joanne avoided prison only by pleading guilty to a lesser charge and cooperating with the financial investigation. The woman who had once performed grief for an online audience was forced to admit under oath that she had written the note, wrapped the box, and helped create the false story that I had suffered a psychiatric breakdown. Their social empire vanished before the criminal cases were finished. The country clubs suspended their membership. Charity boards removed their names from donor walls. Business partners stopped returning calls. Civil claims from my company, the venture capital firm, and several creditors consumed the assets they had spent decades using as proof of their superiority. The $1.5 million in toxic debt attached to the legacy entity was only part of the damage. Legal fees, restitution orders, and civil settlements forced my parents to sell the suburban mansion, the luxury vehicles, and most of their private art collection. They moved into a modest rented apartment far from the neighborhood where my mother had once hosted elaborate galas. For the first time in their lives, money could not purchase a version of events in which they remained the victims. I learned most of this through my attorneys. I never visited them. I never answered the carefully worded letters Joanne sent after her plea hearing. Each one began with a description of how much she had lost, and ended with a reminder that she was still my mother. Not one contained a genuine apology for trying to destroy my business, my marriage, or my sanity. I stopped waiting for one. Outside my office, the gallery moved through an ordinary spring afternoon. That ordinariness felt more valuable than any dramatic revenge. Clients spoke softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Staff members crossed the polished floor carrying condition reports and shipping manifests. Sunlight poured through the front windows and spread across the new exhibition we had brought in from Europe. The international merger had done more than protect the brokerage. It had expanded our authentication department, strengthened our digital security, and opened permanent partnerships in London, Paris, and Geneva. Every genuine client portfolio remained secure. No confidential financial data had ever been leaked. Once the investigation became public, several clients contacted me personally to say that my preparation had strengthened rather than damaged their trust. I stepped out of my office and entered the main gallery. Daniel, my lead curator, was guiding a small group of European collectors around a bronze sculpture near the center of the room. He spoke with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved the work, rather than the status attached to it. At the reception desk, Sarah was coordinating an international shipment while simultaneously calming a nervous first-time buyer. When she finished the call, she looked across the room at me and smiled. For years, I had mistaken biological connection for belonging. I believed family was something I had to earn by surrendering enough money, enough success, and enough pieces of myself. My parents had taught me that love arrived only after obedience. Connor had taught me that intimacy without honesty was simply another locked room. The people standing in my gallery taught me something different. During the investigation, my employees had stayed late to verify inventory rebuild access protocols and reassure frightened clients. Marcus Sterling had protected the company without once asking me to make myself smaller. Detective Caldwell had treated the evidence seriously before he knew whether my family was wealthy, connected, or respected. Evelyn had recorded the truth without allowing anyone in that room to intimidate her. None of them shared my blood. All of them had shown me more loyalty than the people who did. I walked toward the bronze sculpture and rested my fingertips against its cool surface. The piece depicted a figure emerging from a fractured metal shell. I had purchased it years earlier because I admired the workmanship. Only now did I understand why I had always been drawn to it. The shell had not protected the figure, it had confined it. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. For a brief instant, an old reflex tightened my chest. I expected another threat, another demand, or another accusation designed to pull me back into the role my family had written for me. Then I looked at the screen. It was a message from Sarah reminding me that the staff dinner began at 7. No emergency, no manipulation, just people waiting for me because they wanted me there. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked through the gallery's glass facade at the Chicago streets beyond it. Traffic moved steadily beneath the soft evening light. Pedestrians hurried home. The city had not paused for the collapse of my family, and neither would I. My parents had believed that taking my gallery would erase me. Whitney believed controlling my passwords made her capable of controlling my future. Connor believed my trust was an asset he could sell when the price was high enough. They were all wrong. The gallery had never been the source of my strength. It was evidence of it. I turned off the light in my private office, collected my coat, and joined my staff near the entrance. Their conversation filled the lobby with easy laughter as we prepared to leave together. I took one last look at the exhibition, the secured vault doors, and the company name etched discreetly into the glass. The silver box on my doorstep had come with a warning, "Do not make a scene." In the end, I did not have to. I simply preserved the evidence, opened the doors, and let the truth take the stage.